Hello fellow Sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to drift through a quieter kind of history. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for curious minds who can't stop wondering how we became us. Here, time moves differently. We follow the evidence, not the noise. Archaeology, genetics, myth, all told softly like a researcher thinking beside a fire at 2 a.m. Imagine a world where the first winter was not a date on a calendar, but a silence that crept across the land. The last harvest was done, the light sank lower each evening, and somewhere in the chill of late autumn, humans gathered around a fire that did not yet have a name. There were no words like Samhain or November, only the instinct to prepare, to survive, and to mark the moment when the earth itself seemed to pause between life and sleep. Around 5,000 years ago, long before the written word, Neolithic communities across what is now Britain and northwest Europe were already measuring the breath of the seasons. Archaeologists find this awareness not in text, but in stone and soil. Circles of earth and timber, causewayed enclosures, henges, passage graves, were built with astonishing precision to follow the movements of the sun and moon. They weren't temples in the modern sense, but observatories of patience. In those places, humans didn't worship the light so much as learn to predict its return. The dark half of the year was not an enemy. It was part of the rhythm. At the end of the Neolithic, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, Britain was already a land of monuments. From Orkney's Ring of Brodgar to Ireland's Newgrange, people aligned stone with sky. Newgrange in particular reveals how deep this awareness ran. Its long passage was engineered so that for only a few minutes around the winter solstice, sunlight would pierce the darkness and strike the back chamber. This was not random. It was geometry turned sacred. The builders understood that the shortest day was not just the death of light, it was the promise of its rebirth. To survive the long cold, they needed that reassurance. In a world without electricity, the coming of night and the coming of winter were the same thing. Fire was not just warmth, it was continuity. Archaeologists debate whether these monuments marked agricultural cycles or religious belief, but in truth, for those early farmers, the two were inseparable. The grain that sprouted depended on celestial timing. The moon's phases guided not only hunting and planting, but gathering and gathering together. Evidence from Orkney's Ness of Brodgar, where feasting debris and animal bones pile thick in the archaeological record, suggests large gatherings timed to the changing seasons. People brought offerings, slaughtered livestock, and likely kindled great fires. These were not celebrations of plenty, but acknowledgements of limits, of the line between what could be stored and what must be consumed before it spoiled. Winter was a reckoning, and to face it together was the first kind of faith. If you imagine standing among them on that cold plain, the sounds would be minimal. Wind, the crackle of peat, the breath of animals close to the fire. The smoke would rise into a night unpolluted by anything human. Above it, the sky would wheel like a calendar no one could read, but everyone could feel. The moon would grow fat, then vanish. The constellations shifted as slow reminders that time itself was a cycle. Some archaeologists believe that the very concept of the year began with this observation, the recognition that what seemed to end was merely returning. It is possible that these early farmers did not think of time as a straight line, but as a circle marked by darkness and light, warmth and cold, life and dormancy. Every winter's night was therefore a rehearsal for the rebirth of spring. We sometimes imagine prehistoric life as static, but the people who raised those stones were engineers of patience. Aligning Newgrange or Stonehenge required more than brute strength. It demanded generations of careful watching. They tracked the sun's arc, the moon's standstill, even subtle shifts in horizon that marked agricultural thresholds. The pattern of life depended on predicting the return of light, and when that knowledge became collective, it became ritual. Lighting fires at the moment of solar return may have been less a plea to the gods than a symbolic participation in the rhythm of nature itself. The community became the heartbeat of the season. It is here, in these firelit meetings of observation and faith, that the first festivals of winter may have begun, not with a story about spirits or the dead, but with the shared recognition that cold and darkness could be survived if faced together. The fires that blazed on the shortest days of the year were acts of defiance and hope. Physics and psychology intertwined. The flames reflected the human need to make meaning from contrast, to turn fear into ceremony. It is easy to see why later cultures would attach myths of death and rebirth to this point in the calendar. Nature itself told the story. Across the North Atlantic fringe, archaeologists find repeated architectural motifs suggesting synchronization with lunar and solar extremes. The passage tombs of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, the cairns of Scotland, and the wooden circles of southern England all whisper the same logic. Light enters only when the world is darkest. These structures were not isolated inventions. They belonged to a network of cultural exchange that spanned much of Atlantic Europe in the late Neolithic, a kind of prehistoric federation of sky watchers. When radiocarbon dates are aligned, their construction peaks coincide closely with environmental stress events, periods of cooling and failed harvests around 3,000 to 2,800 years before the Common Era. In that uncertainty, the ability to predict the sun's return may have been as vital as storing grain. To those who built them, darkness was a teacher. They had no permanent cities, no armies, yet they understood celestial mathematics to within a fraction of a degree. We find post holes aligned to midwinter sunset, animal bone deposits marking ritual feasts, and pottery decorated with spirals that some interpret as cyclical calendars. These are not random symbols, they echo the logic of renewal. The spiral turns inward, then out again. In that sense, the winter fires were not about destruction, but about resetting the clock of the world. To light a flame in the blackest month was to rejoin time itself. Some anthropologists suggest that these seasonal gatherings were also the seed of social memory. When communities dispersed through summer for farming or herding, winter brought them back to the central places of ceremony. The same pathways, the same fires, the same sequence of rites created identity long before borders or flags existed. In this way, fire was not merely physical. It was political and emotional. It stitched groups together through shared night. Over centuries, the memory of when to return and where may have condensed into mythic language. The first whisperings of named festivals we would only recognise much later. There is something profoundly human in that continuity. Even without written calendars, these people knew that time could be mapped and that knowledge could be shared. Their rituals would have blended practicality and poetry. Clearing old fires prevented disease, controlled pests, and renewed hearths. But it also symbolised a kind of purification, a wiping clean of the previous year's chaos. The first spark lit from a central, communal blaze might have carried both smoke and meaning back into every household. When we speak today about the origins of Halloween or Samhain, we are really reaching back toward this anonymous inheritance. Not to a named festival, but to a psychological moment when early societies first confronted the fear of darkness and turned it into pattern. Every culture eventually built stories around that act, but the logic began here, in the quiet arithmetic of winter nights. Fire, in this sense, was the first calendar, the only clock that spoke in colour. What survives of those early ceremonies is mostly architecture and ash, but together they form a pattern too coherent to be coincidence. At Durrington Walls near Stonehenge, excavations reveal vast gatherings timed to midwinter, with pig bones showing slaughter at the same seasonal window year after year. At the Ness of Brodgar, middens overflow with pottery fragments and food waste from communal feasts, suggesting shared rituals of closure and renewal. Archaeologists find repeated traces of charcoal and burnt timber near entrances, evidence that controlled fire was central to these events. It was both boundary and bridge, separating old from new, light from dark, but also joining the living to their landscape through the same flame. If we step back and imagine what these ceremonies felt like, they might not have been festive in our sense. There was likely solemnity, perhaps fear, certainly reverence. The darkness outside those fires was absolute. For months the sun barely lifted over the horizon. In the North Atlantic world, winter could kill the unprepared. To watch the sun's path reverse, even by a few degrees, would have seemed miraculous every year. In that moment, the boundary between practical survival and spiritual awe dissolved. Humanity learned to find comfort in cosmic repetition. We can never know their words, but their architecture speaks for them. The alignment of stones, the orientation of tombs, the deliberate symmetry of post holes all reflect minds preoccupied with time. This awareness of cyclical order might have been one of the earliest forms of abstract thought, the realization that the world follows a pattern larger than any individual life. In the dark season, this realization became ritual. Fire was how they participated in the turning of the sky. What began as necessity became meaning. When communities gathered to rekindle the central flame, they weren't merely performing tradition, they were resetting their relationship with the world. Darkness wasn't banishment, it was incubation. In that inversion, where night becomes beginning rather than end, lies the origin of all winter festivals that would follow. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth about these ancient fires. They were not asking for summer to return. They were acknowledging that even the longest night contains light within it. Thousands of years before anyone whispered the word Samhain, before there were Druids or legends of spirits, there were people who understood that renewal begins with stillness, and that the first day of the year begins not at dawn but at the dark. We can only reconstruct fragments of their thinking pieced together from soil chemistry, radiocarbon dates, and the orientation of stones. But the consistency of their designs tells us something essential. They shared an unspoken calendar of hope. The fires they lit on those ancient plains were the same gesture repeated every autumn since. The human instinct to light one small flame against the infinite night and call it a beginning. If you enjoy learning this way, calmly without rush, consider liking or subscribing. It helps other sleepless minds find their way here too. Tell me in the comments how you listen. Before sleep, while driving through the dark, studying, or with headphones in bed. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle, there are timestamps below so you can always find your place again. The story of humanity, told softly. And as always, stay curious. Stay calm. Imagine standing in a field of cold grass 4,500 years ago, before dawn, waiting for the sun to rise through a gap between stones taller than any tree you've ever seen. The air burns your lungs, and the ground underfoot is rimed with frost. Around you, hundreds of people have gathered in silence. When the first edge of light breaks the horizon, it floods directly between two monoliths, illuminating a central altar of stone that has been waiting since the last turning of the year. It is not an accident. This was the design. You are standing inside a clock of shadows, a monument built not for gods but for the sky itself. Stonehenge, in its final great phase, rose during this time, between roughly 2,600 and 2,000 years before the Common Era. A period when Europe's climate was cooling and communities were becoming increasingly organised around agriculture and celestial observation. Archaeologists often call it a temple, but that word may miss the point. It was part machine, part memory, an immense tool for measuring the behaviour of light. Its architects understood that the solstices were not mere seasonal curiosities, they were turning points in the logic of survival. When the world tipped toward winter, the sun's daily path shrank to its lowest arc, and each year, humanity faced the same uncertainty. Would it return? The alignment of Stonehenge to the winter solstice sunset is now well established through precise measurement. Standing at the centre of the monument and facing southwest, one can watch the midwinter sun descend perfectly between the great trilithons, the last rays slipping along the axis of the monument before disappearing. This was the signal, the confirmation that the darkest point of the year had been reached, and the cycle of light was beginning again. In a world without writing, this observation was science at its most visceral. The people who built this circle were not primitive. They were astronomers with calloused hands. They could turn stone into an instrument capable of measuring eternity. Archaeological studies show that Stonehenge was not an isolated effort. Across Britain and continental Europe, timber and earth circles were built in similar alignments. At sites like Woodhenge, Durrington Walls and Avebury, these same geometry repeats. Entrances facing sunrise or sunset at specific points in the year, embankments mirroring the solar arcs. Far to the east, in Germany, the Gosseck Circle, older even than Stonehenge, reveals an even earlier experiment in the same idea. Wooden posts marking solstitial points, creating a horizon calendar out of the landscape itself. Together, these structures form a chain of light watchers, stretching across the prehistoric north. They represent not a single culture, but a shared curiosity about time and sky. What fascinates archaeologists today is the precision achieved with such limited tools. Without metal instruments or modern optics, these builders calculated alignments accurate to within fractions of a degree. They noticed how the sun sets further south each evening through autumn, then pauses for a few days before returning northward, a still point we now call the solstice. To detect that stillness requires long observation, patience across generations. The people who stood among those stones were not guessing. They were confirming patterns their ancestors had spent centuries recording. In a sense, these monuments are fossils of attention, evidence that humans had already learned to translate sky into stone. At Durrington Walls, just a few kilometres from Stonehenge, excavations reveal vast evidence of seasonal gatherings. Animal bones show signs of slaughter in midwinter, their isotopes indicating animals brought from across Britain for shared feasting. There were no permanent settlements there, suggesting that people converged seasonally, perhaps to mark the solstice, perhaps simply to be together at the year's edge. The relationship between Stonehenge and these nearby sites may have formed a ceremonial landscape, where timber symbolised the living world and stone the world of the ancestors. If so, the annual movement from one to the other, from wood to stone, mirrored the solar journey from light to darkness and back again. What is often lost in modern imagination is how these alignments were experienced. The winter solstice sunset at Stonehenge is not dramatic like a modern fireworks display. It is slow, patient, and fleeting. The light slides down the corridor of stones in silence, illuminating a few faces before vanishing completely. For people dependent on the land, this moment was not spectacle but reassurance. It proved that time itself was stable, that after the long descent into cold and dark, the sun would begin its climb again. That single sliver of orange light may have carried as much comfort as an entire harvest. In the centuries around 2,500 years before the Common Era, such monuments became more elaborate across the British Isles. Stone rings were joined by avenues, barrows, and processional routes. Each addition deepened the connection between human movement and celestial motion. Archaeologists studying the alignment patterns noticed that many of these avenues guide walkers along a precise visual axis, towards sunrise or sunset at key points of the year. Walking that path was an act of synchronization, human bodies echoing cosmic rhythm. These journeys between light and shadow were the prehistoric predecessors of ritual calendars. Elsewhere in Europe, timber circles performed a similar role. At Gollering in Germany or at the circular enclosure of Goseck, one can see the same concern for orientation. These structures, often built with posts rather than stones, provided a movable frame for observing the sky. The gaps in their palisades correspond to sunrise and sunset positions at solstices and equinoxes. Even when the original post decayed, the post holes remain, preserving the geometry. In their repetition across regions, they reveal a shared language of direction, a recognition that certain points on the horizon held meaning. The question of why these places were built still resists a single answer. Some researchers argue they were calendars, others that they were ceremonial centres linking communities. But the two functions may not have been separate. To know when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for winter required both empirical knowledge and social agreement. The monuments provided a place for both, the physical alignment confirming the season, and the gathering itself reinforcing community through ritual. Science and society were born together in stone and shadow. At Newgrange in Ireland, contemporary with Stonehenge's construction, another kind of alignment appears. There, a narrow shaft above the doorway channels sunlight deep into the tomb's chamber at dawn on the winter solstice. For only a few minutes each year, the interior, dark and silent for the remaining 364 days, is pierced by a beam of golden light that touches a carved spiral at the rear. The effect would have been breathtaking. From the outside, nothing changes. From within, the world ignites. This was not random architecture. It was the deliberate translation of cosmic order into human space. The builders turned stone into a lens for time itself. To us, such feats seem mystical, but they were grounded in observation. These communities watched the sky long enough to notice patterns invisible to casual eyes. The standstill of the sun, the shift of shadows, the slow drift of the moon's rising points over an 18-year cycle. This body of knowledge, what modern researchers call archaeoastronomy, suggests that prehistoric peoples combined empirical observation with mythic interpretation. The data guided them, but the meaning gave it purpose. Light became symbol, shadow became measure. One detail that emerges from excavations is the emphasis on duality. Monuments often have paired entrances, twin alignments, or alternating materials, stone and timber, white chalk and dark soil, perhaps reflecting the binary rhythm of the year itself. Summer and winter, day and night, life and death. The act of building in stone may have embodied the wish to preserve what changes. In a world where every season threatened hunger, permanence itself was a prayer. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from this period find evidence of people travelling long distances to these sites, sometimes hundreds of kilometres. Isotope analysis of teeth shows individuals arriving from the Welsh mountains, from Scotland, even from continental Europe. They brought livestock, tools, and perhaps songs. This convergence implies that the solstice gatherings were pan-regional events, occasions when distant groups reaffirmed alliances. The sky served as neutral ground. No one owned the sun's path. Everyone depended on it. If we strip away modern assumptions, these gatherings might have been less about worship and more about orientation, both literal and psychological. When the world darkens and cold presses in, humans have always sought alignment, some sign that time still flows. To stand together facing the same horizon at the same moment was to affirm belonging to something larger. It's easy to see why later cultures inherited this instinct, transforming it into festivals of renewal. But for the builders of Stonehenge and its kin, it was simpler. Watching the dying light was watching themselves survive another cycle. One cannot help but wonder how they perceived their own place in time. Did they know they were building for millennia? Perhaps not. But they certainly built for memory. Each winter, as the sun set along the same axis, they were reminded that their ancestors had seen this before and that their descendants would see it again. In that repetition lay a form of immortality. Every beam of solstice light was a handshake across generations. We can reconstruct their mathematics, measure their alignments, and map their stones. But the experience, the silence, the cold air, the collective breath held at sunset, remains beyond calculation. Standing there today, even surrounded by tourists and camera phones, one can still feel the precision of their intent. The monument is not just about the sun's position, it is about the human need to know that there will be a next time. The world still turns toward winter, and we still light our small fires to mark it. Our cities may hum with electric light, but the impulse is the same, to find meaning in the slow return of the sun. Stonehenge and its kin remind us that our ancestors already solved that mystery, not with equations, but with endurance. They learned that the only way to measure time was to feel it pass. And perhaps that is what those stones still say now, in the language of shadow, that nothing truly ends, that even the dying light carries the memory of morning. Imagine the sound of the first bronze being poured into a clay mould somewhere in Western Europe, the hiss of molten metal meeting air, the smell of earth and smoke mixing, the gleam of a tool or a blade that would never rust like stone. It was more than a new material, it was a new rhythm of life. Around 4,300 years ago, a people we now call the Beaker culture began to spread across the continent, carrying not only metal but memory. With them came something subtler than weapons or trade goods, a way of keeping time that joined sky, season, and ceremony into one enduring pattern. When metal met memory, the world's oldest calendars began to move again. The Beaker phenomenon began near the Atlantic coast of what is now Iberia, and gradually rippled outward through France, the Low Countries, and into the British Isles. Its name comes from the distinctively shaped drinking vessels left behind. Bell-shaped pots decorated with fine geometric lines, often found beside graves. But the people who made them were not a single tribe or empire. They were travellers, craftsmen, and herders whose ideas and technologies blended with those they met. The Beaker expansion was less an invasion than a slow merging of worlds. Local Neolithic communities with deep ritual traditions meeting newcomers who carried new materials, new tools, and perhaps new ways of understanding time. We know this movement not from ancient texts, there are none, but from isotopes locked inside bones and teeth. By analysing strontium and oxygen isotopes, scientists can tell where a person grew up and where they died, tracing migrations in invisible maps of geology. These studies show that Beaker individuals moved widely. A man buried near Stonehenge, for instance, had grown up hundreds of kilometres away in the foothills of Central Europe. Others found in the Netherlands or Spain show similar long-distance origins. This mobility was unprecedented for the time. With it came not just trade in goods like copper and tin, but trade in ideas, especially the idea that the heavens themselves could be measured, shared, and standardised. Before the Beakers arrived, Neolithic communities in Britain and Western Europe had already developed local ways of marking the seasons through solar alignments, as we've seen at places like Stonehenge. But the Beaker networks connected those local observatories into something larger. Across their vast range, archaeologists find circular enclosures, standing stones and burial mounds aligned in remarkably consistent ways to solstitial and equinoctial points. The repetition of these orientations from Iberia to the British Isles hints at a shared understanding, a pan-Western rhythm of the year that transcended individual valleys or tribes. It was as if these people carried the calendar itself in their minds, moving it from one landscape to another. Alongside this celestial awareness came metallurgy, the control of fire hot enough to transform rock. Bronze was not simply a new material, it was a new metaphor. To create it, one had to combine elements and wait for transformation. much like the way seasons blend and return. The same fires that smelted copper and tin may also have rekindled the great ceremonial blazes that marked the turning of the year. The technology of the forge and the ritual of the solstice shared a common language: heat, patience, and renewal. In their burial customs, the Beaker people left traces of this worldview. Graves often contain carefully positioned bodies, oriented towards sunrise or sunset, depending on sex, age, or region. Grave goods, cups, arrows, ornaments, mirror the patterns of life, but their orientation suggests a continuing awareness of cosmic direction. The dead were not sent off at random. They were aligned with the same precision as the monuments. Even in death, the calendar continued. One of the most remarkable features of this period is how local traditions adapted rather than disappeared. In Britain, for instance, isotopic evidence shows that the Beaker newcomers intermarried with the descendants of the Stonehenge builders. Archaeologists once imagined a dramatic cultural break between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, but the record now shows continuity in ceremony even as new materials arrived. Timber circles gave way to smaller stone monuments, and large communal tombs were replaced by individual graves. But the cosmic orientation persisted. The logic of winter and summer, of death and rebirth, remained. The technology changed. The timekeeping did not. From a scientific standpoint, what makes this era fascinating is its data density. Radiocarbon dating allows us to see the rapid spread of Beaker artifacts across Western Europe within just a few centuries. This was not a slow diffusion, but a cascade of innovation. Within a few generations, copper and tin were being smelted in places thousands of kilometres apart, yet the pottery designs and burial rites remained strikingly similar. It implies communication, not empire, but conversation. Networks of traders and travellers carried both awe and stories, connecting Atlantic and continental Europe in a way unseen before. In that web of movement, the measurement of time likely became a shared foundation. To coordinate trade, to plan seasonal gatherings, to plant and harvest in new territories, one needed to know when the year would turn. What might those gatherings have looked like? Archaeological evidence from sites such as Le Petit Chasseur in Switzerland or the stone rows of Carnac in Brittany suggests that people continued to use older ritual landscapes even as they added new markers. Fires still burned at seasonal thresholds, but now bronze tools gleamed beside them. Beaker bracelets and daggers appear in ceremonial contexts, perhaps used in offerings to mark the changing seasons. Some of the earliest metal hoards, carefully buried collections of bronze objects, may represent ritual deposits timed to celestial events. The rhythm of metallurgy itself, with its dependence on temperature and transformation, may have reinforced the symbolism of seasonal cycles. Genetic studies deepen this picture. Analysis of ancient DNA reveals that the Beaker expansion involved both movement of people and exchange of culture. In some regions, new populations replaced earlier ones almost entirely. In others, they merged. The result was a hybrid world, one that combined the deep-rooted ceremonial traditions of the Neolithic with the technical and social dynamism of the Bronze Age. In this synthesis, the modern concept of a calendar year, divided by predictable seasonal festivals, may have found its first pan-European expression. As the Beaker people settled and mixed, their influence reshaped how communities understood continuity. Instead of vast communal tombs that embodied the collective dead, we see individual burials that connect the person to the wider cosmos through orientation and grave goods. The focus shifted from ancestry to recurrence, from who came before to when the light would return. It was a subtle philosophical shift, perhaps the beginning of seeing time as something cyclical yet personal. Archaeologists studying isotopic data from animal bones suggest that livestock management also adapted to this new rhythm. Seasonal patterns of slaughter, indicated by tooth wear and growth rings, align with solstitial and equinoctial intervals. Herding itself became a calendar, reflecting not just practical timing but ceremonial logic. The year was divided not only by harvests but by gatherings, times when humans, animals and the sky came into alignment. The bell beaker legacy also appears in architecture. Across Western Europe, we find roundhouses and enclosures built with doorways facing sunrise or sunset, echoing the orientation of earlier monuments but scaled to the domestic level. Timekeeping moved from sacred landscapes into everyday life. Each household became a miniature observatory, aligned with the same celestial pattern that governed the great stone circles. To wake and see the dawn strike through a doorway was to live inside the calendar. One of the most striking things about this period is the spread of shared motifs, spirals, solar discs, radiating lines, carved on pottery, stone and metalwork. These images may not have been purely decorative. They mirror astronomical cycles, perhaps representing the sun's path, the moon's phases, or the eternal return of light. A spiral scratched into a bronze dagger handle or etched on a beaker could have been more than ornament. It was an encoded version of time itself, portable and personal. In that sense, the bell beaker expansion was also an expansion of consciousness, an attempt to make the rhythm of the heavens tangible in every object. We can't know what songs they sang, but it is reasonable to assume that they marked the turning of the year with music and movement. Experimental archaeology shows that the acoustics of stone circles amplify low-frequency sound, suggesting that ritual chants or drums could have been part of these gatherings. The combination of sound, firelight, and celestial alignment would have created experiences designed to be remembered, to be repeated, and to anchor communities in the same cycle year after year. That repetition, observation followed by celebration, was perhaps the first calendar in practice, a living one written not on parchment, but in behaviour. As the centuries passed, the bell beaker culture dissolved into the broader currents of the early Bronze Age, but its inheritance persisted. The solar-lunar logic they helped standardise spread into the emerging Proto-Celtic and Italo-Iberian worlds, setting the stage for later festival calendars that would formalise the year's turning points. The idea that time could be divided, predicted and celebrated became part of Europe's cultural DNA. Even long after their pottery styles vanished and their graves were forgotten, the rhythm they established continued, 4 seasons bound by light and shadow, renewal and rest. When we stand today before those weathered stones or excavated graves, what we're really looking at is the memory of measurement. The bell beaker people didn't invent the passage of time, but they gave it shape that others could inherit. They turned migration into mathematics, fire into chronology. The same intelligence that smelted bronze also smelted the idea of the year into something enduring, a framework we still live inside without thinking. And perhaps that is their quiet triumph. They proved that time could be both local and shared, personal and cosmic. They made the sky portable, a pattern you could carry across mountains and seas. Every modern festival that honours the return of light, every winter gathering, every candle lit against the dark owes something to that inheritance. The moment when metal met memory and the year itself began to sing in rhythm with the sun. Imagine looking at the night sky with nothing but a bronze blade polished to a mirror's surface. The stars shimmer faintly on its edge, and the moon glows across the curve of metal like a pulse of living time. Somewhere in that reflection, a human mind begins to count. The rhythm of days and nights, the long drift of seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon. It all fits together like the gears of an invisible machine. But who first tried to capture that rhythm, not in story or ritual, but in calculation? Somewhere between 1500 and 900 years before the Common Era, humans crossed a quiet threshold. They stopped only watching the heavens and began predicting them. The Bronze Age was an age of measure. Across Europe, people were no longer content to live inside the cycles of nature. They wanted to map them. For thousands of years, communities had tracked the solstices with monuments of stone, aligning architecture with light. Now, in a world shaped by bronze, they carried the calendar in their hands. The evidence of this shift lies scattered across a continent, in discs, markings, and ritual objects that combine art, metallurgy, and astronomy in ways that still astonish us. It is here that time itself begins to take physical form. One of the most enigmatic of these objects is the Nebra sky disk, discovered in Germany and dated to around 3,600 years ago. Though earlier than our main period, it is part of the same intellectual revolution. The disk, hammered from bronze and inlaid with gold, depicts a crescent moon, a cluster of stars believed to represent the Pleiades, and a luminous arc thought to mark the solar path between solstices. When studied alongside other artefacts of the era, it becomes clear that people were no longer just observing celestial events. They were constructing a system to predict them. This is a leap from reaction to anticipation, from watching to knowing. The builders of the Bronze Age were becoming mathematicians of the sky. Archaeological finds across Central Europe reinforced this pattern. In Denmark, Ireland, and southern Germany, rock carvings from this period show sun wheels, boats carrying solar discs, and spirals that seem to mark lunar cycles. Bronze blades, pendants, and ceremonial shields bear symmetrical patterns whose geometry matches lunar months. These designs were not random decorations. They may have served as mnemonic devices, tools to remember sequences of days, nights, or moon phases. The act of etching bronze, an enduring material, meant encoding knowledge for generations. For the first time, time itself was being recorded on something that could outlast its maker. By 1,500 years before the Common Era, the builders of Europe had turned this celestial awareness into something systematic. Bronze hoards from this period often include sets of similar objects, each slightly varied in shape or symbol, as if forming part of a counting system. Some archaeologists suggest these sets functioned as portable calendars, small coded references to seasonal events like sowing, herding, or ritual gatherings. It is tempting to see these artifacts as the distant ancestors of the later lunar solar systems that would appear many centuries afterward. But even without names or inscriptions, the logic is visible. The people who shaped bronze into spirals and circles were mapping the moon. The key difference between earlier and later ages is intent. In the Neolithic world, alignment was observational. One built a monument and waited for the sun to confirm its path. In the Bronze Age, the alignment became predictive. With a combination of lunar and solar knowledge, these societies could forecast when the next solstice would fall, when the moon would be dark or full, and when certain agricultural or ritual actions should begin. This was not superstition. It was data, and the tools they created, calibrated artifacts of bronze and gold, were their instruments. The link between metal and time was more than practical. The colour of bronze mirrored the light of the setting sun. The polish of gold resembled dawn. Many ritual objects blend these materials, as if to hold both day and night within a single surface. To polish a disc until it reflected the sky was to make a portable horizon. These people did not separate technology from theology. The same mind that smelted copper and tin understood that transformation required precision. Too much heat and the alloy fails. Too little and it remains unjoined. That sensitivity to balance carried over into their understanding of the heavens. They realized that nature itself moved in a kind of metallurgy, where time was the furnace and light the product. This fascination with cycles extended into architecture. Around this period, new types of enclosures appeared, smaller circular sanctuaries often built of wood or earth, oriented toward lunar rise and set points. Unlike earlier megaliths, these were designed for tracking short-term celestial changes, not just the grand turning of the solstice. They could register the moon's monthly path or the rare moment when the moon and sun aligned perfectly in eclipse. The builders may not have understood the mechanics, but they recognise pattern. To them, an eclipse was not chaos. It was confirmation that the universe followed hidden rules. In Britain and Ireland, the later Bronze Age saw a decline in large public monuments, but an increase in small-scale ritual sites. Cairns, stone rows, and cup-marked rocks carved with repeating circular motifs. These carvings often occur in patterns that repeat every 29 or 30 marks, matching the length of a lunar month. Some researchers believe they were local calendars used to coordinate herding, hunting, and seafaring. The lunar cycle governed tides, migrations, and the behaviour of plants and animals. Counting the moon was counting life itself. By roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era, this system of lunar reckoning had merged with the solar year into a hybrid rhythm, a lunar-solar understanding that balanced the two. The sun dictated the seasons, the moon subdivided them. 12 lunar months fell slightly short of the solar year, creating a discrepancy that had to be corrected. Archaeologists see evidence of such corrections in the addition of 13th months or intercalary periods, marked in certain rock carvings and tally systems. This awareness of discrepancy is crucial. It shows that Bronze Age people were not merely imitating nature, they were managing it mathematically. The cognitive leap from observation to adjustment marks the true birth of scientific thought. Artifacts like the Trundholm sun chariot from Denmark, a bronze horse pulling a golden disc mounted on wheels, reflect this synthesis of motion and meaning. The object, dated to about 3,500 years ago, may have represented the daily journey of the sun across the sky and through the underworld, but it also encodes rotation itself. The use of wheels, both literal and symbolic, suggests an understanding that time moves in cycles, endlessly revolving. To pull the sun on wheels was to make the heavens mechanical. The sophistication of this astronomical awareness likely had social consequences. Keeping accurate track of time gave certain individuals, priests, metalworkers, navigators, new forms of authority. Knowledge became a kind of power. The ability to predict celestial events or seasonal changes could legitimize leadership and organize communities. Bronze itself became the medium of both control and communication. It carried information not only in its form, but in its symbolism. A chieftain who could hold the sky in his hand was someone worth following. In the archaeological record, we can trace this consolidation of knowledge in the distribution of prestige objects. Bronze discs, daggers, and ornaments travel hundreds of kilometres, their designs nearly identical, as if part of a standardised symbolic language. This diffusion implies a shared understanding of time and ritual. Whether in Ireland, Iberia, or Central Europe, the sun remained the clock, the moon its measure, and bronze the page on which both were written. The very act of etching calendars into bronze may have altered how humans experience time. When you inscribe a pattern meant to repeat forever, you begin to imagine time as something stable and external, not merely felt. It becomes a structure outside of human life, one that can be studied, adjusted, and improved. That cognitive shift, from living in cycles to describing them, is the foundation of every calendar since. It is what allowed later societies to predict eclipses, plan agriculture, and eventually record history. And yet, for all their precision, the Bronze Age calendar makers likely saw their work as sacred rather than scientific. Each mark, each inlay of gold, was an offering to the balance of the world. They did not seek to dominate nature, but to remain synchronized with it. Their calendars were not tools to control the future, they were bridges to remain within its flow. When the first bronze discs reflected the winter moon, they may have been held up not to measure but to honour the continuity between heaven and earth. We can only guess how these systems were taught, perhaps through apprenticeships among smiths, or rituals among the learned few. Knowledge was fragile, it could vanish with a single broken lineage. That fragility makes the surviving evidence all the more remarkable. Across millennia the same geometry repeats, circles, spirals, and divisions of 12. These symbols survived because they worked. They matched what the sky revealed. As the late Bronze Age approached its end around 900 years before the Common Era, Europe entered a period of climatic instability and social change. Trade networks faltered, hoards of bronze were buried, and some of the great ceremonial centres were abandoned. Yet the knowledge encoded in metal endured. Even as communities shifted and languages evolved, the lunisolar logic remained embedded in cultural memory. The people who would later inherit these lands did not start from nothing. They inherited a map drawn in light. The story of those who first measured time in moonlight and bronze is not about perfect accuracy or modern astronomy. It is about intention, the desire to find pattern amid uncertainty. They proved that prediction begins with patience, and that the sky rewards those who pay attention for a lifetime. The next time you glance at the moon and know what phase it will take next week, you're echoing the same calculation that began on a polished bronze disc held up against the stars thousands of years ago. What if the oldest New Year began in the dark, not the light? Imagine a time when the calendar was not a wall of numbered squares, but a landscape of shadows and returning warmth. Around 900 to 600 years before the Common Era, across Western Europe a new rhythm took hold, one not divided into 4 neat seasons as we know them today, but into 2 vast halves. The light and the dark, the growing and the resting, the summer and the winter. This was the first division of the year, and it was born not in mathematics or writing, but in movement, of herds, of people, and of the quiet certainty that time itself was a cycle of departure and return. The clues to this ancient calendar lie scattered in the ground, in language, and in the invisible habits of those who lived from the land. Archaeologists studying Bronze and early Iron Age Europe see that life was organised around 2 massive transitions: the time when herds were driven to upland pastures for summer grazing, and the time when they were brought back down for winter shelter. These weren't just logistical decisions, they were entire social events, markers that structured life, labour and ritual. Summer meant expansion, open air, green fields, communal labour. Winter meant contraction, hearths, storytelling, maintenance and waiting. Between those 2 worlds stood thresholds, times of gathering, of fires, of endings that felt like beginnings. Pollen data, animal bone assemblages, and isotopic studies reveal this annual pulse with surprising clarity. In upland regions of Britain, Ireland and Gaul, evidence of seasonal herding persists deep into the Iron Age. Sheep and cattle were moved along predictable routes, what anthropologists call transhumance. These routes formed living calendars. The start of the dark half of the year was not marked by a date, but by a task: bringing the animals home. The new year began not in celebration of light, but in acknowledgement of survival, the moment when humans and their herds retreated together into the safety of enclosures. In archaeological layers from this period, there's a recurring pattern. Burnt material and feasting debris appear in autumnal deposits, suggesting collective gatherings timed to these transitions. At certain hill forts and settlements, animal bones show cut marks consistent with slaughter at the onset of winter, when surplus livestock would have been culled. This was both practical and symbolic. The dark season began with fire and sacrifice, reducing the herd to what could be sustained. The community's energy turned inward, toward endurance. In many ways, this was humanity's first fiscal year, an accounting not of currency but of calories. Linguistics offers a parallel record of this twofold world. Across the Western European languages that would later branch from Proto-Celtic roots, we find traces of a binary division embedded in vocabulary. Words for summer and winter are among the oldest and most stable, outlasting the terms for spring or autumn. This linguistic persistence suggests that for millennia, people recognised only 2 essential states of nature: the time of growth, and the time of withdrawal. Later, Indo-European languages would inherit this same pattern. Even in early Welsh and Gaulish dialects, the year is expressed as turning between these halves, a rhythm rather than a line. Archaeologists working in France have identified evidence of seasonal structures at sites like Corinth and Bibracte, where patterns of occupation indicate cyclical habitation, settlements populated only during part of the year. These findings hint at an early social calendar where communal centres activated during transitional periods, perhaps for trade, ceremony or lawmaking. The timing of these gatherings aligns closely with the late autumn and early spring windows that separate the two halves of the pastoral year. Those were the moments when society literally moved. In agricultural terms, the same rhythm governed the soil. The end of summer harvest marked the closing of the active year. Crops were stored, fields left to rest. Archaeobotanical remains from Iron Age granaries show spikes in storage activity, corresponding to early winter, when yields were secured. That transition between full granaries and cold nights was both a relief and a reckoning. Everything from diet to ritual adjusted to this cycle. The first division of the year was not imposed by kings or priests. It arose from the landscape itself. This binary understanding of time shaped not only labour but imagination. Across regions as distant as Brittany, the Alps and the British Isles, archaeological motifs of circles split by a central line appear on pottery and jewellery. They may represent more than abstract geometry. They could symbolise the balance of light and dark, the turning halves of the year. Bronze and early Iron Age art increasingly plays with symmetry and reflection, as though to remind its makers that every fullness contains its shadow. To understand this worldview, it helps to think not of winter as an ending, but as a beginning. The new year, in this early European logic, started when the sun's strength was weakest. It was a declaration of faith, that light would return, that cycles endured. This inversion of modern intuition is crucial. The oldest New Year began in darkness because darkness was continuity. It was the womb of time. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that midwinter and midsummer served as fixed anchors, but the actual start of the year, the hinge between halves, fell near the onset of winter. In faunal assemblages, the seasonal slaughter and butchering patterns match this timing, suggesting a yearly rhythm that began when life contracted. This is the logic later encoded in the idea of summer's end. It is the recognition that survival begins with retreat, that the accounting of the old year closes when warmth departs. Even in burial practices of this era, seasonality can be glimpsed. Some Iron Age cemeteries show clustering of interments around the months when the soil would have been softest, spring and autumn, but offerings and grave goods with animal motifs or fire traces often correspond to early winter rites. It is possible that remembrance of the dead coincided with the start of the dark half, when the boundary between seasons, and perhaps between the living and the departed, felt thinnest. The same fires that mark the new year may also have honoured ancestors, binding the past and the future in one cyclical act. Climate reconstructions show that around 900 years before the Common Era, Europe experienced a gradual cooling trend. The darker, wetter winters and shorter summers would have reinforced this dualistic view of time. To people whose survival depended on pasture, firewood, and stored grain, the division between the two halves of the year was existential. It was not philosophy, it was planning. Communities that failed to prepare for winter risked vanishing entirely. In that sense, the calendar was less about dates and more about discipline. One of the most revealing glimpses of this mental framework comes from the architecture of storage and defence. Hill forts and roundhouses from this period were often built with narrow south-facing entrances, designed to capture precious winter light and shield against prevailing winds. The orientation of homes themselves became an act of synchronization with the year's darker half. To wake each morning facing the low sun was a quiet ritual of alignment, a daily rehearsal of cosmic order. metallurgical and trade evidence adds another layer. The distribution of bronze hoards and iron artifacts often clusters around times of seasonal transition. Some hoards seem to have been buried deliberately as offerings at the year's turning, perhaps marking the boundary between productive and dormant seasons. A tool or weapon placed in the ground was both sacrifice and timekeeping, a way to acknowledge the end of one cycle and the promise of another. These caches of metal are in a sense frozen calendars, each deposit a punctuation mark in the great paragraph of the year. By 600 years before the Common Era, the twofold division of time appears to have been firmly established across Western Europe. Archaeological layers show consistent rhythms of settlement, storage, and migration following this pattern. In linguistic terms, reconstructed Proto-Celtic words for summer's end and winter's beginning already existed, suggesting that the concept was deeply rooted in the collective mind long before written records appeared. The names have changed, but the logic remains ancient. Summer gives way to winter not in despair, but in preparation. From an anthropological perspective, this simple binary calendar may have had profound effects on cognition. To divide the year into two was to divide existence into opposites: light and dark, life and death, motion and rest. The earliest philosophies of balance and renewal likely emerged from this rhythm. The agricultural year became a mirror for the human condition, the recognition that endurance depends on letting go, that growth requires stillness. The fire that burned at the threshold of the dark season was not just for warmth. It was a declaration that knowledge of the world begins with its cycles. Even today, the remnants of that logic survive. We still celebrate endings as beginnings, our new year arriving not with harvest or bloom, but with the cold promise of renewal. That idea is not modern. It is inherited from a time when humans learned to trust the unseen half of the cycle, when the darkness of winter was not feared, but revered as the start of time itself. Archaeologists may never uncover a single artifact labelled calendar, but in the movement of animals, the rhythm of fires, and the orientation of homes, the first division of the year is written everywhere. It represents one of humanity's earliest cognitive milestones, the moment we began to measure existence by contrast, to find meaning in alternation rather than permanence. We can trace this logic in the soil, in words, in the seasons themselves, and it leads to a simple truth that still humbles modern minds. The oldest New Year did not wait for dawn. It began in the dark, trusting that light would return as it always had. Imagine a night when every hearth in the valley has gone dark. Smoke no longer rises from any house, no torch burns along the path, and for the first time in months, silence stretches between the hills. In that stillness, all eyes turn upward, to one single height, where a new flame waits to be born. When it catches, when that first spark leaps from wood to air, the whole landscape seems to breathe again. One by one, torches are lit from it, carried down by messengers into the waiting dark. Within hours, the hills glow once more, each fire a reflection of the same original light. This is not myth. It is ritual memory, written in ash and landscape. Across the early Iron Age world, around 600 to 400 years before the Common Era, entire communities gathered for this moment. The controlled extinguishing and rebirth of flame, the world's oldest purification by fire. Archaeologists and folklorists believe that these hilltop bonfires were far more than celebrations. They were the heart of a collective reset, marking the transition between the two halves of the year. The logic was both symbolic and practical. Before the new year could begin, the old fires, tainted by the decay and disease of the past months, had to die. Every hearth was allowed to go cold. Only one central fire, kindled in ceremony upon a sacred hill, could renew the flame of life for the entire community. That new blaze was drawn from the friction of clean wood, sometimes aided by sacred tools or embers kept from a previous cycle, and once it burned, it was considered pure. The archaeological record gives us glimpses of how this might have looked. In Ireland, the site known as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, modern hill of Ward in County Meath, contains layers of ash, charcoal and burned soil dating back to this exact period. Excavations reveal repeated burning events, not random or destructive, but deliberate, controlled and recurring. The hill's position, visible from other ceremonial centres like Tara, suggests that it served as a beacon visible for miles. Imagine standing in one valley and seeing the horizon flicker to life with answering fires on other hills. The light itself was communication. Each flame declared that the cycle had renewed, that life and community were still aligned. This was not unique to Ireland. Across Britain, Gaul and the broader Atlantic world, similar hilltop enclosures and ring fours bear the same evidence of large-scale burning episodes. Ash pits, fire-reddened soil, layers of carbonized timber. The pattern repeats often enough to imply intention. In many cases, these burn layers occur in seasonal intervals, roughly corresponding to late autumn or early spring transitions. The synchronization across regions hints at a shared understanding of what fire meant: purification, renewal, and unity. It is important to remember that in the early Iron Age, fire was still a living presence. It required tending, feeding, respect. Hearth fires were rarely extinguished casually. They symbolized the household's life force. To put them all out simultaneously was a serious act, a ritual pause in existence. In that moment of darkness, a community was briefly without protection. Wild animals, cold, and superstition all pressed in. Only when the sacred fire was rekindled did safety return. This collective vulnerability willingly entered gave the renewal its power. The logistics of such an event would have been complex. Archaeologists studying hearth residues find that during these ceremonies, fires were not simply smothered, but ritually extinguished, covered with ash, sprinkled with water, or symbolically dyed with food offerings. Then, from the central bonfire, small embers were distributed among the households, likely carried in clay vessels or on smouldering peat wrapped in moss. Ethnographic parallels in later European folk customs describe similar practices. Fire carried carefully from place to place, so that each home could relight its hearth with the communal flame. This made the community literally one fire, many hearths. There is scientific logic behind the ritual. Periodically extinguishing domestic fires would have reduced soot build-up, pests and pathogens associated with constant smoke. It was a form of sanitation disguised as ceremony. By framing it as a sacred act, the community ensured everyone participated. The result was both practical and psychological cleansing. The valley slept in darkness only to awaken cleaner, safer and synchronized. The choice of hilltops was no accident either. These high places, often ringed with earthworks or stone banks, served both as defensive sites and ritual theatres. Their visibility made them natural focal points for collective ceremony. In many, archaeologists find animal bones and ceramic fragments among the ashes, signs of feasting and offerings. The fire on the hill was not only an act of renewal but of gratitude, the closing of one agricultural cycle and the beginning of another. The elevated position symbolized proximity to the heavens, the boundary between human effort and cosmic order. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, the stratigraphy of burned material is especially revealing. Each layer of ash sits atop another, separated by thin bands of soil, evidence of repeated seasonal fires over centuries. Some layers contain fragments of pottery and food waste, while others include traces of animal bone calcined at high heat, suggesting ritual sacrifice or communal meals. The consistency of these deposits implies institutionalized ceremony. This was not a spontaneous village bonfire, it was the beating heart of an organized calendar. What we find here is the first archaeological proof of cyclical purification, a community deliberately erasing its own fire to start again. In a sense, this was their science of entropy and renewal. The act of extinguishing was as important as the act of lighting. It acknowledged that decay is part of continuity, that even flame must die to remain pure. This principle would echo through later European rituals for millennia, eventually reshaping itself into festivals of cleansing, resurrection, and rebirth. Evidence from other regions strengthens the case. On the Scottish island of Lewis, similar burnt mounds contain layers of heated stone and water channels, possibly used for steam-based purification or communal cooking linked to seasonal feasts. In France and southern Britain, hilltop burn layers dating to the same centuries suggest widespread cultural synchronization. These were not isolated villages experimenting with fire, but parts of a shared Atlantic ritual system. The symbolism of the dark valley and the single reborn fire also fits neatly within the cosmological logic of early Iron Age Europe. This was an age increasingly aware of duality, light and shadow, summer and winter, life and death. The fire renewal ritual mirrored this worldview perfectly. By extinguishing all flames, people enacted the death of the old year. By relighting them from a single source, they performed the rebirth of the world. It was cosmology enacted through daily life, a participatory form of philosophy. Experimental archaeology offers glimpses of what these ceremonies might have felt like. When large timber pyres are built on open hills, the light can be seen for dozens of kilometres. The glow reflects off low clouds, turning the night sky red. The heat, even from a distance, can be felt on the face. The smell of burning oak and animal fat, the crackling of wood, the rhythmic chants that may have accompanied it, all combine into an experience of awe. For people whose survival depended on cooperation, such shared moments forged bonds stronger than any political structure. We cannot know what words they spoke, but we can infer their logic. Fire was life, and life required maintenance. By gathering each year to restart the flame, they reminded themselves that the world, too, required care. Nothing was eternal. Everything needed renewal. Even the sun itself, dipping lower each autumn, seemed to follow this rule. The community mirrored the cosmos. This practice also reveals a remarkable degree of organisation. To coordinate the extinguishing of every hearth across a valley, leaders, perhaps chieftains, elders, or ritual specialists, had to issue signals, maintain order, and oversee the collection of new fire. It required trust. Each household depended on the others to uphold the ritual properly. If one family failed to extinguish its fire, the purity of the renewal might be seen as compromised. Thus, the ceremony reinforced social cohesion through shared responsibility. Some archaeologists interpret the evidence of these recurring fires as early forms of what later societies would call assembly festivals, occasions when dispersed populations gathered to reaffirm laws, marriages, and alliances under the banner of cosmic renewal. The timing, likely at the onset of winter, made sense. Agricultural work was finished and people were free to travel. In the glow of the new communal fire, disputes could be resolved, trade arranged, and memory reset. By around 400 years before the Common Era, the pattern of these hilltop fires seems to have declined or transformed. Climatic and social changes altered settlement patterns, and new rituals replaced old ones. Yet the logic survived in folklore. Centuries later, in regions once touched by these Iron Age cultures, we still find echoes of the extinguish and renew tradition. Bonfires on hills during seasonal transitions, embers carried home, the association of fire with cleansing and beginnings. The continuity is not coincidence. It is cultural inheritance across thousands of years. To stand today on the hill of Ward after sunset is to feel that memory underfoot. The land still holds the scent of ash in its soil. The surrounding hills align on the horizon much as they did then, forming a natural amphitheatre of light. Archaeologists can measure the layers update the charcoal, analyse the soil chemistry, but the meaning remained something quieter, more human. The desire to pause the world, extinguish it for a heartbeat and start again. We may never know the exact prayers or chants that accompanied those fires, but we know the gesture. To kill every flame so one might return is an act of collective trust in time itself. It says, we can face the dark together, and together we will relight it. In that way, the ritual of renewal was not just about survival. It was about belief in continuity, the courage to let go of light so that it could be born again. What if I told you that for some of the earliest Europeans who kept calendars, the day did not begin with sunrise, but with darkness? That every measure of time, every birth, every festival, every year, was counted not by days, but by nights. This inversion of what we now consider obvious reveals more than a quirk of language. It exposes a completely different way of thinking about the world. Around 400 to 100 years before the Common Era, as Celtic-speaking cultures spread across Western Europe, their worldview carried a remarkable principle. Light is not the start of time, it is what follows. We know this because of the strange linguistic footprints it left behind. When Julius Caesar wrote of the Gauls in his commentary De Bello Gallico, he noted with curiosity that they count by nights, not by days. Birthdays, festivals, even the start of months and years began with nightfall. The day, he said, follows the night. It sounded backwards to Roman ears, but to the people he described it made perfect sense. In their cosmology, night was not absence, it was origin. Light could only exist because of what came before it. Archaeology and linguistics together suggest that this idea was ancient, perhaps inherited from Bronze Age traditions that already divided time by darkness and renewal. In Celtic languages, many words for day and night still preserve the ordering of darkness first. Old Irish, for instance, uses the phrase inocht, literally this night, to mean tonight, reflecting the idea that the cycle starts in the dark. The Welsh word wythnos, meaning week, translates literally to 8 nights. Even here, the measure of 7 days is framed by the nights that bound it. These are not linguistic accidents. They are the grammar of a cosmology. To count by night is to acknowledge the structure of existence as alternating states of potential and manifestation. Night is when the unseen gathers. Day is when it emerges. This rhythm appears in nearly every aspect of Celtic life. Seasonal festivals such as the turning points of the year, summer's end, winter's beginning, were always said to begin on the eve, at dusk. The light of the bonfire or hearth marked not the continuation of the day, but the birth of a new one. The night was the threshold of transformation. From a practical standpoint, this night-based reckoning likely arose from observation. In a world without artificial light, darkness was measurable. The moon offered a visible, repeatable cycle, easily divided into phases. Days, by contrast, were unreliable. Cloud cover could obscure the sun, storms could disrupt the pattern. The moon was constant, its return dependable. Early astronomers, priests and farmers learned to anchor their calendars to its rhythm. In the night sky, time could be seen unfolding, a luminous metronome marking life's tempo. The lunar month, still embedded in many languages, is a linguistic fossil of this early science. The connection between counting and darkness may also reflect social reality. Much of communal life happened by firelight, feasting, storytelling, ritual. The day was for labour, the night was for memory. It was in darkness that knowledge was shared and the past recited. Oral culture depends on gathering, and gathering depends on fire. The night became a symbol of continuity, the time when ancestors were remembered, and the living reaffirmed their place in the cycle. Daylight scattered people across fields and paths, but night gathered them again into unity. Archaeological evidence supports this emphasis on darkness and renewal. Hilltop enclosures associated with Iron Age ritual sites often contain traces of fire use, but also periods of deliberate extinguishing, temporary darkening followed by relighting, as if to mark the passage of time itself. These cycles mirror the linguistic pattern Caesar observed. The new always follows the extinguished. To light a fire after darkness was not merely practical, it was cosmological punctuation. Even the Celtic year itself, reconstructed through linguistic and ethnographic parallels, seems to embody this nocturnal logic. The division between the warm and cold halves of the year, between growth and retreat, was timed to the boundary of darkness, the end of summer's light and the beginning of winter's shadow. The new year began not at dawn, but when the sun's strength was weakest. Darkness was not feared, it was trusted. It was the space from which life returned. When we look at this pattern through anthropology, something striking emerges. Societies that count by nights tend to have cyclical conceptions of time, while those that count by days lean toward linear ones. In a night-based worldview, endings are beginnings. The year dies so it can be born again. Time does not march forward, it breathes. This dual rhythm may have shaped Celtic religion, art, and law. Many mythic structures from later sources preserve the motif of descent and return, heroes who vanish into the underworld only to re-emerge transformed. These stories are not moral allegories, they are reflections of a calendar embedded in cosmology. The act of naming time reveals how a culture imagines existence. To say that a week has 8 nights, or that a festival begins on the night before, is to structure reality around recurrence and trust in renewal. Even the word Samhainos, from which the later name for the end of summer festival derives, carries echoes of this duality. Sam for summer, Fuin for end or setting. It is not the destruction of summer, but its folding into shadow. One can imagine how this temporal philosophy would have felt to live by. Imagine standing on an Iron Age hill fort as twilight deepens. The sun sinks behind the ridge, but to the people watching, the day is not ending. It is beginning. The first stars flicker like embers catching, and the moon's slow rise marks the renewal of the world. The air cools, fires are lit, and the rhythms of work give way to the rhythms of story and ritual. In that moment, night is not the opposite of life, but its pulse. There is also a linguistic beauty to this way of reckoning. In night-counting societies, words for tomorrow often mean the next night, not the next day. This subtly changes how people perceive the future. It is not something bright waiting ahead, but something gestating in the unseen. Hope, then, is born not from illumination but from patience. The world renews itself in silence before it returns to sight. Comparative anthropology shows that this inversion is not unique to the Celts. Several early Indo-European languages, including ancient Germanic and Indo-Iranian, preserve traces of nocturnal reckoning. The very word fortnight, 14 nights, is an English survival of this older logic. Counting by nights may have once been the default across much of prehistoric Eurasia, later replaced by solar-based systems as society shifted toward written calendars and agriculture-driven precision. But among Celtic-speaking peoples, this older rhythm persisted remarkably long, perhaps because it resonated with their social and spiritual environment. This worldview challenges our modern assumption that light equals progress. For these early Europeans, darkness was not ignorance or death. It was the womb of continuity. Their metaphors of fertility, renewal, and even wisdom were often associated with shadowed places. Caves, mounds, the night sky. The cycle of day and night mirrored the human life cycle itself. Birth emerging from darkness, returning there at the end. To live by nights was to live with that rhythm consciously. we can glimpse its practical side in the timing of labour and ritual. Seasonal tasks such as herding, planting and harvesting were still guided by solar cues, but the marking of communal events, their beginnings, endings and renewals, was lunar. The calendar of the sky and the calendar of the people were not identical, but intertwined. In the human calendar, meaning began when the light disappeared. Linguists studying early Celtic inscriptions and later medieval survivals find the same structural pattern embedded in syntax. The placement of words for time, the pairing of dual opposites, light and dark, summer and winter, reflects a world view organised by balance rather than hierarchy. The night does not precede the day because it dominates it, but because it frames it. The darkness gives shape to what follows, just as silence gives meaning to sound. From a psychological perspective, this approach to time may have offered comfort. In a volatile world of uncertain harvests and harsh winters, the assurance that every period of darkness would lead naturally into light carried profound resilience. The calendar itself was a philosophy of endurance. It said, "This too is part of the cycle. The world will return." As the Iron Age drew to its close and written traditions began to take hold in neighbouring cultures, this nocturnal reckoning gradually faded from practical use. Solar calendars, imported from the Mediterranean, emphasized daylight and precision, months of named days rather than counted nights. But the old language remained embedded in memory. The phrase, "the night before," continued to mark beginnings long after the reason was forgotten. Even today, when we celebrate at midnight or mark the eve of a new year, we are unknowingly keeping faith with that ancient logic, that the future begins in darkness. To count by nights is to honour what cannot be seen but can be trusted, the unseen turning that keeps life in motion. It is the mathematics of mystery, the science of patience. Long before anyone called it philosophy, it was how people lived. By the rhythm of firelight and shadow, the pulse of the moon across an unbroken sky. What if I told you that beneath the myths of oak groves and chanting Druids lay a mathematics of the moon, one so precise that it mirrored the same 19-year cycle, later rediscovered by Greek astronomers? When Roman chroniclers first wrote about the Druids in the last century before the Common Era, they described philosophers, astronomers and scientists rather than simple mystics. Julius Caesar himself, fascinated by what he saw as their discipline of mind, noted that they discussed the stars, the size of the universe, and the motion of the heavens. It is an odd detail to survive from a military campaign, yet it hints at something profound, a scientific culture rooted in observation, ritual, and time. By the time Rome expanded into Gaul and Britain, the Druidic system of knowledge had already matured. These were societies where ritual and reason were not opposites but partners. Every ceremony, especially those involving fire, harvest or renewal, was scheduled by celestial events. The priests of these communities were both calendar keepers and cosmologists. They knew, perhaps by tradition stretching back centuries, that the lunar and solar cycles did not align neatly. 12 lunar months fell short of the solar year, creating a creeping misalignment that could only be corrected by adding an extra month every so often. To maintain cosmic harmony, they needed to track this drift, and to do so required mathematics. Across Western Europe, from Ireland to the Rhone Valley, archaeological and linguistic traces suggest that Druids followed a lunar-solar calendar, the same kind of system used in Babylon, Greece, and other centres of early astronomy. But their version, reconstructed from later artefacts like the Coligny calendar, was astonishingly intricate. The Coligny bronze plates, discovered in France and dated to around the 1st century of our era, preserve a fragment of this sky mathematics. When analysed, they reveal a 19-year cycle, the Matonic cycle, where lunar and solar years reconcile. 19 solar years equal roughly 235 lunar months. After this period, the phases of the moon return to the same dates in the solar year, creating a repeating celestial harmony. It is extraordinary to think that Iron Age astronomers could recognise such a cycle without telescopes or written equations. The only tools they had were their eyes, their patience, and their memories. But if we imagine generations of skywatchers passing down precise records, when the moon was full, when it rose, when the seasons shifted, it becomes possible. Over centuries, patterns emerge. The same full moon rises near the same horizon every 19 years. The calendar becomes not just a measure of time, but a living model of the cosmos. The Coligny plates, though Roman in craftsmanship, encode a logic far older. Each month is divided into bright and dark halves, reflecting the old tradition of night-based counting. The months themselves are named in a language ancestral to Gaulish, each associated with seasonal events: growth, harvest, cold, renewal. The calendar tracks a 5-year cycle of 60 lunar months, with periodic corrections to realign it to the solar year. But the larger rhythm, the one hinted at in the repeated inscriptions and divisions, follows the 19-year pattern known to modern astronomy. This means that whoever designed it had not only observed the sky, but understood how to reconcile the sun and moon, two clocks that rarely agree. Such precision suggests an institutional body of knowledge. Druidic education, described by classical writers, could last as long as 20 years. Some have interpreted this as mythic exaggeration, but if one's training involved memorizing celestial cycles, it begins to make sense. To learn the 19-year sequence of lunar phases without written notes would require both discipline and inherited mnemonic systems. The oral structure of Druidic learning, using rhythm, story, and chant, may have been not just spiritual but practical, a method of encoding astronomical data in narrative form. The connection between ritual and calculation was intimate. Fire festivals, solstice observances, and harvest rites were all timed to moments when the moon and sun formed meaningful alignments. The winter fires that once renewed the year were likely coordinated to the dark moon nearest the solstice, ensuring that the rebirth of light was mirrored in both celestial bodies. To ignite a sacred flame at that precise convergence was to synchronize human life with the cosmos. Every act of ritual purity, every extinguishing and relighting, was in its own way a calibration of the world. This blending of observation and devotion is what made the Druidic system so resilient. It was not recorded in books, but embodied in behaviour. Even when Roman authors tried to describe it, they could not separate the scientific from the sacred. To the Druids, numbers were not abstractions. They were the pulse of creation. The 19-year cycle, the alternation of bright and dark months, the pattern of fire festivals, all were expressions of balance. Where modern thought divides reason from reverence, they saw continuity. To measure the sky was to honour it. Archaeological evidence from megalithic observatories like Lamennec in Brittany and later Iron Age sanctuaries in France and Britain supports this long continuity of astronomical awareness. Some enclosures align with major lunar standstills, the extreme points in the moon's 18.6-year oscillation along the horizon. These alignments are subtle and require decades of observation to detect. That they appear in ritual sites suggests that lunar tracking was central to both sacred and practical life. The same knowledge that scheduled ceremonies would have guided agriculture, navigation, and communal planning. When we look closely at the Coligny calendar, we see more than a table of dates. We see a worldview codified in bronze. Time as a cycle of renewal, life as a sequence of dark and bright phases. The months alternate between 30 and 29 days, reflecting the lunar rhythm, but they are grouped in fives, echoing the half-decade substructure. Corrections appear as additional months marked intercalaris, inserted to keep the calendar in harmony. The precision is staggering for a society without written arithmetic. It implies not casual observation, but institutional science, perhaps managed by specialised classes of sky priests whose duty was to keep the world in balance. And yet, for all its sophistication, this system was not coldly mathematical. The Druids did not separate astronomy from ethics or ritual. The correct timing of ceremony was a moral act. If the fires were lit too early or too late, the harmony between the human and the cosmic would falter. Misalignment was disorder, both spiritual and ecological. The calendar was not a schedule. It was a covenant between people and the sky. Modern scholars sometimes underestimate how deeply such calendrical systems shaped daily life. To live by the lunar cycle is to feel time as texture rather than line. Nights wax and wane, seasons breathe. The 19-year cycle was perhaps not even fully grasped conceptually by all, but its effects were experienced through ritual repetition. Every generation someone would say, "This moon is as our ancestors saw it." Continuity itself became sacred. It is worth remembering that while the Greeks and Babylonians left written records of their astronomical knowledge, the Celts and Druids left patterns, architectural, linguistic, and ritual. The colony calendar is the closest we have to their textbook, and even it reads more like poetry than ledger. The months have names that sing Samonios for the time of endings, Giamonios for the depths of winter, Elembivios for rain, Riuros for frost. Each reflects not an abstract date but an environmental reality. Time was felt, not numbered. This marriage of measurement and meaning created a system of extraordinary emotional power. To track the 19-year lunar cycle was to accept that every event, even life itself, would recur. The same moon that watched one generation's birth would return to the same position 19 years later, looking down on their children. The calendar turned the heavens into memory, the night sky into genealogy. It was not about predicting the future, but preserving connection across time. In that sense, Druidic astronomy was both scientific and humanist. It sought precision, not for control, but for harmony. When Caesar remarked on their knowledge of the motion of the heavens, he may have glimpsed this balance without understanding it. To the conqueror, it was a curiosity. To those who practiced it, it was identity. The sky was their archive, and the moon their teacher. As the Roman world advanced its solar calendar, fixed by emperors and administrators, this older lunar logic began to fade. But its echoes persisted. The collinear plates, buried perhaps to protect or preserve them, stand as a bronze fossil of a world view that refused to separate light from dark, science from spirit, or counting from believing. When we study those engraved marks, the rows of numbers, the phases of months, the careful divisions of cycles, we glimpse the quiet brilliance of people who measured time by moonlight. Their mathematics lived not in scrolls but in ceremony, not in ink, but in rhythm. They did not chart the heavens to conquer them. They did it to remember their place within them. And perhaps that is the oldest form of wisdom we still understand, that the more we know of the sky, the more humble we become before it. Imagine a world where the written record forgets your gods, but the land remembers them anyway. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire stretched across most of Western Europe. Its armies had crossed the Rhine, its governors ruled Britain, and its merchants moved through Gaul. Yet beneath the new stone roads and Latin inscriptions, an older rhythm of time and worship persisted quietly, almost invisibly. It was a rhythm that counted by nights, not days, that began the year in darkness, that saw fire not only as light but as renewal. The Romans never wrote the word Samhain, but the soil did. For archaeologists, this period is one of paradox. From roughly 50 to 400 years after the Common Era, the material record in Celtic lands becomes both richer and quieter. There are coins, temples, and pottery in abundance, but fewer of the clues that reveal local ritual life. Written sources, controlled by Roman authors, describe the official pantheon, not the private hearth. The Druids, once described by Caesar and others as philosophers and scientists, vanish from text as if erased. But archaeology tells another story, one of adaptation rather than extinction. Romanization was rarely total. The empire had an unmatched ability to absorb, not annihilate. Across Gaul and Britain, rural communities continued to practice local customs long after imperial administration took hold. Excavations of rural shrines, simple enclosures near springs, groves or hilltops, show patterns of continuous use from pre-Roman into Roman times. Offerings still burned, figurines still stood, and fires still marked the turning of seasons. The forms changed, the meanings did not. A bronze votive may bear the name of Mercury, but the offerings placed before it are local in origin. Grain, honey, the bones of sacrificed animals. The name is Roman, but the god beneath the name is older. This blending, what historians call syncretism, is one of the most fascinating phenomena of the era. When the Romans encountered a foreign deity, they often equated it with one of their own, a practice known as interpretatio Romana. The Gaulish sky father became Jupiter, the mother goddess, a version of Minerva or Juno. But beneath these translations, the agricultural calendar and the rituals tied to it remained rooted in older cycles. When Romans celebrated Saturnalia in midwinter, a festival of reversal and renewal, local communities in Gaul and Britain may have synchronized it with their own end-of-year rites, the dark season when the world's order turned upside down. The overlap was not coincidence, but convergence. Both systems understood the necessity of death before rebirth. The difficulty, for modern researchers, is that silence leaves fewer artifacts than speech. We can only glimpse continuity through absences and substitutions. For example, the deliberate burning of sites, a feature of earlier Celtic ritual practice, continues in the Roman era, but with altered context. At some shrines, layers of ash and charcoal appear beneath new Roman-style constructions, suggesting that older fires were ritually extinguished before new temples were built. It was as though the local population accepted Roman architecture but insisted on renewing it their own way, by burning the past to make room for the present. Rural cemeteries tell a similar story. In regions far from urban centres, burial rites remained distinctly local. While Roman cities practiced cremation and later inhumation under formal law, rural graves often contain hybrid elements, personal amulets, animal bones, and traces of seasonal offerings. Many of these interments occur in patterns suggesting cyclical visitation, perhaps tied to agricultural or calendar rituals. Even under empire, the year's dark threshold remained a time for memory, offering, and fire. In Britain, this continuity is especially clear in the countryside beyond the reach of Roman roads. Hill forts abandoned for centuries were occasionally reoccupied, their ramparts reused for feasting and fires. The locations themselves held power. The same hilltops that once hosted communal bonfires now glowed again, though perhaps under Roman names. Archaeological layers from these sites show late Iron Age and early Roman pottery mixed together, meaning the change in empire did not erase the local calendar. The festivals may have gone unrecorded, but they went on being lived. There is an eloquent quietness to this endurance. It tells us that some cultural structures do not require writing to survive. They live in behaviour, in the timing of the harvest, in the extinguishing of fires, in the rhythm of labour and rest. Even if no one spoke the old names, the pattern of the seasons itself kept them alive. The same dark time of year that had once marked renewal in the Bronze and Iron Ages would continue to do so under Rome. The difference was that now it existed beneath a veneer of empire whispered rather than declared. In the northern provinces, including Gaul and Britain, Roman rule brought roads, trade and taxation, but not full assimilation. The empire's reach was powerful but practical. Officials cared more for grain quotas than for how villagers marked the winter's end. In that space between authority and indifference, tradition survived. Archaeologists find evidence of late Roman rural feasting, large quantities of pig bones, burned grain and seasonal hearth cleaning, recurring around the same calendar window year after year. The timing matches the old transition between light and dark halves of the year. The meaning may have shifted, but the moment endured. We see the same continuity in the persistence of boundary fires and household rituals. In parts of Gaul, layers of ash and charred domestic debris are found just outside settlement enclosures, renewed seasonally. Some scholars interpret these as remnants of purification rituals, where old fire and waste were symbolically cast out before the new year began. The practice has parallels across pre-Roman Europe, suggesting that the Roman centuries did not extinguish the custom but absorbed it. The empire may have reshaped cities, but in villages and farms people still lived by the land's older logic. This is perhaps the most important realization of this period, that cultural endurance often happens below the level of empire. Empires record their victories, farmers record their harvests. The Romans left inscriptions and calendars chiselled in stone, but the local populations left calendars of behaviour, repeated gestures that no conqueror could fully overwrite. Lighting a fire at the darkening of the year was one of those gestures. Even the imperial festivals that seem most dominant were often localised. Saturnalia, the Roman celebration of midwinter, with its feasting, gift-giving and reversal of roles, would have felt familiar to those in Celtic lands. The overlap was not accidental. Both traditions shared a sense that time itself loosened during the darkest days, that social order could invert before being reset. It is easy to imagine how rural communities might have folded their old rituals of extinguishing and renewal into the wider imperial festival, reinterpreting it without losing its essence. To them it was not a Roman import, but another mask for an ancient truth, that every year must die to be reborn. What we lack in text we recover through the landscape. Many late Roman sites in Britain and Gaul are built atop earlier ritual centres, springs, hilltops and enclosures reused continuously for centuries. The persistence of sacred geography suggests that even as belief systems changed, the locations of meaning remained. It is not that the Romans tolerated old gods, they simply built new names over them. The continuity of place allowed continuity of practice. A farmer might bring offerings to a shrine labelled Mercurius, but in his heart he was still speaking to the same spirit his ancestors had invoked before empire. By the 3rd century, the empire itself was fragmenting. Trade routes faltered, cities shrank, and rural life regained autonomy. In that decentralisation, older practices re-emerged more visibly. The archaeology of late Roman Britain reveals renewed local craftsmanship, pottery styles reverting to regional traditions, hearths once again dominating domestic architecture. The empire's authority was fading, and with it, the oversight that had kept rural rituals discreet. The darkness, both literal and cultural, was returning. When the legions finally withdrew from Britain around the early 5th century, the Roman world left behind more than ruins. It left layers of silence, centuries in which the written record ceases but the landscape still speaks. Bonfire sites, boundary markers, and seasonal deposits continue to appear in the archaeological sequence. No one called them by the old names anymore, yet the pattern is unmistakable. The old festivals did not survive because people resisted change. They survived because the earth itself still moved by the same rhythm, and humans, no matter the empire, still depended on its return. It is humbling to realise that the most enduring parts of a civilization are often those least recorded. The Roman calendars carved in marble have crumbled. The rural fires, renewed each autumn, have left traces of charcoal still visible today. Through those blackened layers, we can read continuity written not in words but in heat. So when we ask what survived after Rome forgot to write down the gods of its conquered peoples, the answer may be simple: time itself. The calendar of darkness and renewal never ended. It just went unmentioned. It passed through empire the way water passes through stone, slowly, invisibly, reshaping from within. And perhaps that is the quiet genius of this forgotten religion of fire and night. It never needed to declare itself to endure. While empires rose and fell under the stars, the old fires kept burning, just low enough that the wind of history couldn't blow them out. Imagine a world where the empire has fallen silent and the only memory of order is firelight. Around the 5th century of our era, the Roman world collapsed in the west, leaving its provinces scattered like embers in the wind. Roads decayed, cities emptied, and with them went the written memory of centuries. But not everything vanished. Across the far edges of Europe, in the islands of Ireland and Wales, in lands untouched by Rome's bureaucracy, memory survived in a different form. It lived in speech, in ritual, in stories told beside the hearth. And when literacy returned, centuries later, what those people wrote down first was not the chronology of kings or the dates of battles, but the rhythm of seasons, the turning of years, and the night when all fires were extinguished so that one might be born again. The first thing they remembered was Samhain. When Irish monks began to write their language in the early medieval period, between the 6th and 9th centuries, they did so with a mixture of Latin letters and older rhythms of thought. The manuscripts they left us, tales like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒, or glossaries compiled by scholars such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒, were not inventions of the monastic mind. They were written echoes of something already ancient. In these texts, Samhain appears not as myth or metaphor, but as a living hinge of the year. It marks the ending of summer, the beginning of winter, the night when the world's boundaries grow thin. The way these sources speak of it, casually as a known fact, reveals that it was not a literary invention. It was cultural memory set to ink. In 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, a tale of warriors and love composed from oral tradition, Samhain is mentioned as a time of both danger and renewal. Armies are said to gather then, kings to host great feasts, spirits to wander freely. The night is described not as one of fear, but of heightened potential, the crossing of thresholds. The text, though written centuries after the Iron Age, preserves details that feel older than its parchment. Gatherings on hilltops, the extinguishing and rekindling of fires, the sense that the year itself pauses in the dark before moving again. It is one of the earliest written hints that the old rhythm survived empire and conversion alike. What makes this remarkable is that such knowledge persisted entirely through oral tradition. Between the 4th and 7th centuries, Ireland had no urban centres and no Roman infrastructure. But what it did have was continuity. Genealogies, laws and rituals were memorised and transmitted through a class of poets and learned custodians who functioned as living libraries. The Druids of earlier centuries may have vanished in name, but their intellectual descendants, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒, carried on the same work of preserving order through story. By the time writing arrived, these oral systems had already distilled centuries of observation into stable forms. The year still began in darkness, just as it had in the Bronze Age. Cormac's glossary, compiled in the 9th century but drawing on much older material, gives one of the clearest definitions of Samhain. He writes that it was the festival at which the pagans of Ireland began their year, held when the summer ended and winter began. The gloss also explains that during this time, fires were kindled and omens taken of every kind. The precision of that phrasing suggests that even in a Christianized world, the memory of the ritual remained vivid. It is not described as something distant or mythical. but as a fact of the calendar, a mark of how deep the association between darkness and renewal ran in the cultural imagination. The endurance of this idea, the year beginning in shadow, shows how resilient pre-Roman timekeeping was. The old binary division between the light and dark halves of the year, already present 1,000 years earlier, had survived every upheaval. Archaeological evidence supports this linguistic continuity. Hilltop sites such as Tlactga and Tara continued to show layers of burning well into the early medieval period. Even as Ireland's political map fragmented into small kingdoms, the ritual geography remained intact. Fires still rose on the same hills, visible across the same valleys. The ceremonies that once bound tribes together under the Druids may now have bound Christian and pagan communities in shared seasonal rhythm. One of the most fascinating things about this era is how memory disguised itself to survive. The same monks who copied Latin Gospels onto vellum also recorded the tales of their ancestors, often without condemning them. They treated the old stories as history, not heresy. In doing so, they inadvertently preserved Europe's deepest time layer of cosmology, the conviction that creation renews itself through darkness. The fire was not rejected, it was reinterpreted. By the 7th and 8th centuries, this synthesis had produced a distinct kind of literature. The Irish sagas are not simple hero tales. They are time machines, encoded with ecological and astronomical knowledge. When they describe warriors travelling at Samhain, when the summer's end comes and the dark half begins, they are echoing an age-old awareness of balance between abundance and scarcity, light and shadow. The festivals of kingship described in these texts, feasts where laws were renewed, oaths sworn, and fires rekindled, likely trace their lineage back to Bronze and Iron Age assemblies. What had once been ceremony now survives as story. The transition from oral to written culture did not flatten this knowledge, it deepened it. When writing first arrived in Ireland, it was not used to create new ideas but to capture what already existed. That act of transcription transformed memory into endurance. It meant that the logic of the dark new year, of renewal through extinction, would no longer depend solely on living speakers. It could now survive in silence, waiting to be read again centuries later. This period also marks a psychological shift. When literacy returns after a long absence, the first things people choose to preserve reveal what they fear losing most. For the early medieval scribes, it was not the details of trade or warfare but the structure of time itself. To record when the year begins, how it divides, when the fires are lit. This was to anchor existence in continuity. In a world of shifting kingdoms and collapsing memory, the calendar was identity. Samhain was not just a festival, it was proof that order still existed in the cycle. The Welsh material from roughly the same era shows a similar pattern. In texts like the Mabinogion and early triads, we see echoes of a year divided into two halves, and of certain nights when the boundaries between worlds weakened. The terminology differs, but the cosmology is the same. The preservation of this dual year across two languages and two islands suggests a common prehistoric root. Even separated by geography, the descendants of the old Atlantic Bronze Age culture still move to the same rhythm. If we step back, we can see how remarkable this is. Between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval kingdoms, Europe endured 4 centuries of fragmentation. Roads crumbled, literacy nearly vanished, and countless local traditions disappeared. Yet the logic of fire renewal survived intact. The simplest explanation is also the truest one. It survived because it worked. Lighting new fire at the darkening of the year was not only symbolic but practical. It cleaned soot-choked hearths, unified scattered communities, and prepared households for winter. The ceremony persisted because it was both science and myth, a ritual that explained the world while helping people survive it. Even the language of these early texts reveals continuity with prehistoric thought. The Irish term Samhain contains the root sam, meaning summer, and fuin, meaning end or setting. It does not mean death, only completion. The word's endurance across centuries shows how people conceived of time as cyclical and agricultural rather than absolute. Summer does not vanish. It simply sets, like the sun, to rise again. The metaphor of the year dying and returning is as old as the first fires in Neolithic stone circles, and by the 8th century, it was still the foundation of Irish cosmology. We often imagine that literacy erases or overwrites oral memory. But in early medieval Ireland and Wales, it acted more like a fossilizing agent. It preserved the contours of older belief even as new layers formed above it. In the quiet between the last Druids and the first monks, something extraordinary happened. Myth became manuscript. Fire became history. By the time these stories were written, the rituals that inspired them may have already changed, but the meaning remained. Every year, as autumn darkened and the last harvest was gathered, people would still gather at their hearths, extinguish the old flames, and wait for the light to return. They may not have called it by the same name, but the act was the same, trusting in darkness as the beginning, not the end. To read these early manuscripts today is to watch the rebirth of memory itself. And when literacy returned to the Western world, that was what humanity remembered first. Not conquest, not fear, but the memory of fire. Imagine that the first day of winter is not marked by a date, but by a battle. A cosmic struggle played out every year between the bright and the dark, the fertile and the barren, the known and the hidden. In the old Irish story known as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, the Second Battle of Moytura, this war is fought not between mortals, but between the divine tribes of Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians. To a medieval reader it might appear as mythology, full of magic and prophecy. But beneath the poetry lies something older, a memory of how early agricultural societies explain the yearly death of light and the promise of its return. The tale survives in manuscripts written between the 11th and 12th centuries, though its roots reach much deeper. The language of the earliest versions and the agricultural imagery embedded within suggest that it preserves elements from the Bronze Age, when ritual, weather, and survival were all bound together. The setting of the story is not random. The battle takes place at Samhain, the turning of the year. The darkness that descends is not merely metaphorical. It is the literal shortening of days, the fading of harvest, the time when the sun withdraws and the earth sleeps. What the myth captures, in a language of gods and warriors, is the moment when humans face their most ancient fear, that the light might not return. In the narrative, the Tuatha De Danann, often interpreted as the bright gods of order, craft, and civilization, are ruled by Lug, the many-skilled hero. Against them stand the Fomorians, beings of chaos, storm, and sea, led by Beaker of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, a monstrous figure whose gaze brings death. Their conflict is not between good and evil in the moral sense, but between two halves of existence, the constructive and the destructive, the harvest and the decay. When Beaker opens his single deadly eye, the crops wither and life retreats. When Lug strikes him down with his spear or sling, fertility is restored and balance returns. To an early farming people, this was not just a story. It was cosmology made vivid. Archaeologists and comparative mythologists have long suggested that such myths encode seasonal logic. Across Indo-European traditions, we find variations of this same battle. The Greek Zeus overthrowing Kronos, the Vedic Indra defeating the serpent Vritra to release the waters, the Norse gods struggling against frost giants. In each version, order and renewal depend on the cyclical triumph of the life-bringing force over the hoarders of light or water. The Fomorians' attempt to seize the harvest from Ireland mirrors the encroachment of winter itself. when food becomes scarce and darkness claims the land. Lug's victory, though temporary, reasserts the cosmic rhythm, a reassurance that light and growth will return after the long night. If we strip the myth down to its agricultural skeleton, the structure becomes clear. The story begins at the end of abundance, the last of the harvest gathered, the cattle brought in from pasture. Tribute is demanded by the Fomorians, grain, milk, and fruit, all symbols of sustenance. Their demand represents the coming scarcity of winter, the natural tax exacted by time. The Tuatha De Danann's preparation for battle echoes the communal preparations for winter, storing grain, mending tools, lighting protective fires. The battle itself, fought under darkening skies, dramatises the struggle for continuity. When Lug slays Babda, the act is both mythic and meteorological. The moment the sun's decline halts, and the hope of spring is secured. What makes the Battle of Moytura extraordinary is how scientifically observant it is, though wrapped in mythic imagery. The text is filled with references to the flow of seasons, the significance of timekeeping, and the renewal of laws. Lug's recovery of his grandfather's magical harp, which can summon summer and winter at will, reflects not fantasy, but knowledge, an allegory for the early mastery of calendars and celestial cycles. The harp's strings stand for the tuning of the year, each vibration a measured interval between light and dark. Come summer, come winter, the god commands, as if announcing the rebalancing of the world after chaos. From an anthropological perspective, the story also mirrors social reality. Early Irish kingship was cyclical and conditional. A ruler's legitimacy was bound to the fertility of the land. A bad harvest could unmake a king as surely as defeat in war. Rituals performed at Samhain often involved symbolic contests, perhaps echoes of this mythic battle. The extinguishing of communal fires and the rekindling of one central flame on a sacred hill could be seen as a peaceful reenactment of the cosmic conflict. Destruction followed by renewal, darkness followed by rebirth. In that sense, the story is less about violence than about equilibrium. The Fomorians themselves may not have been gods in the divine sense, but personifications of the forces that early people could not control. Storms, disease, the unpredictability of the sea. The name Fomorian may derive from Fomhuir, meaning from under the sea, but also connotes something primal, ancient, and untamed. To a farming people, these beings represented the external pressures that threaten survival every winter. The Tuatha De Danann, by contrast, were aligned with craftsmanship, agriculture, and measured order. The humanists attempt to impose stability upon nature. When they win, civilization holds. When they falter, the wild reclaims the fields. Lug himself stands at the symbolic crossroads. He is both warrior and craftsman, lightbringer and lawgiver. His victory is not one of annihilation, but of restoration. After defeating Baelor, he does not destroy the Fomorians, but forces them to contribute to the prosperity of the land. A mythic way of saying that chaos is not eliminated, but harnessed. Even darkness has its place in the cycle. It must retreat, not vanish, because life depends on its return. This understanding of balance, not dominance, is what makes the Irish myth so mature. It is not a triumph of light over dark, but a treaty between them. Scientific analysis of the story's structure also reveals parallels to astronomical cycles. The timing of the battle aligns with Samhain's position between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice, a cross-quarter day when the year's light visibly shifts. The motifs of sight and blindness, of the eye that kills, and the hero who sees, may encode early observations of solar decline. Baelor's closing eye could symbolise the sun's descent, while Lug's counterstrike is the reawakening of light. Some researchers have noted that the myth's imagery resembles Bronze Age solar iconography found on artefacts like the Trundholm sun chariot or the Nebra sky disk. suggesting that this myth was part of a pan-European tradition linking solar motion to divine struggle. What we can say with certainty is that the myth was not arbitrary invention. It was a mnemonic, a way to store ecological and astronomical knowledge in emotional form. Before the written word, stories were calendars, and gods were equations turned human. Through ritual retelling, each generation learned when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for the long night, and in telling of battles and heroes, they also remembered that survival depended not only on work, but on hope. The Battle of Moytura may also reflect a real historical memory, the fusion of different peoples in Ireland's prehistoric past. The conflict between Tuatha Dé Danann and Fomorians could allegorize encounters between agrarian and seafaring cultures, between those who lived by land and those who lived by the tides. The myth's synthesis of these forces, its refusal to vilify one side completely, suggests that it encoded an early philosophy of coexistence. Even chaos, when understood, becomes part of order. By the early medieval period, when Christian scribes recorded the tale, it had already fossilized into a grand cosmic allegory, but its scientific soul still glimmers beneath the literary surface. To the ancient mind, myth was not separate from knowledge. It was knowledge translated into memory. Every fire lit at Samhain, every hilltop ceremony, was a reenactment of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, a reaffirmation that the cycle still held. And yet, even in victory, the myth carries humility. 𝐓𝐿𝐼's triumph is temporary. The darkness will rise again, as it must, and the battle will be fought anew each year. That acceptance of repetition, of balance rather than conquest, might be the deepest wisdom the story holds. It is not about defeating the night, but learning to live with its return. In the end, what survives in the Battle of Moytura is not the details of gods or monsters, but a world view. That the universe is rhythmic, not linear. That every loss carries the seed of renewal. That the sun itself must die so that spring can be born. When we light candles or fires in the dark months, we are, in some quiet way, continuing that same ancient truce between light and dark, acknowledging both as sacred. Because every winter still begins with a battle, not one of weapons, but of memory and faith in the returning sun. What if the Church didn't erase the old calendar, it simply baptized it? Imagine the twilight of the early Middle Ages, when Europe still lived half in Latin, half in the languages of memory. Monks were learning to measure the year by Roman time, yet the people beyond their walls still spoke of summer's end and the dark beginning that came with the first frost. Between the 7th and 9th centuries, an unlikely negotiation began, not between armies or kings, but between calendars. One kept its faith in the sun and the moon, the other followed the saints. Somewhere in that compromise, Samhain became All Hallows. The transition wasn't sudden. When the Western Roman world fell apart in the 5th century, the Church inherited not a unified empire, but a mosaic of local traditions, each with its own rhythms of planting, reaping and renewal. Missionaries sent to Gaul, Britain and Ireland discovered that time itself was organised differently. The year didn't start in spring as the Roman calendar once had. It began in the dark. The Celtic division of summer and winter persisted stubbornly, even as Christianity spread. And so, rather than fighting the rhythm of the seasons, the Church did something quietly revolutionary. It absorbed them. The earliest Christian calendar didn't yet include All Saints' Day. The practice of honouring martyrs was local and variable. By the early 7th century, Pope Boniface IV had dedicated the Pantheon in Rome to St. Mary and all martyrs, setting the feast on May 13th. It was an urban ritual bound to Mediterranean sunlight. But far to the north, the rhythm of worship moved to a different beat. By the time of Pope Gregory III in the early 8th century, the date had shifted to the 1st of November, a decision that may have been less theological than practical. In northern Europe, harvest was over by then, the weather still passable for pilgrimage, and food stores newly full. A feast of remembrance fit perfectly into that cycle of conclusion and renewal. Some historians see the shift as administrative convenience, others as deliberate adaptation. When Christian missionaries reached pagan regions, they often found it easier to integrate local festivals than to abolish them. The correspondence of the November 1st feast with the older Celtic New Year is difficult to ignore. The same lands that once marked Samhain as the night when the dead walked were now asked to light candles for the souls of saints and martyrs. The vocabulary changed, but the emotional structure remained. It was still a season for remembrance, still a liminal time between worlds. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period hints at the persistence of dual observance. Hilltop sites like Tlactga, where fire rituals had once united entire valleys, continued to be visited well into the Christian era. Excavations show activity layers overlapping pagan and Christian phases. Ashes mingled with later burial offerings and devotional tokens. Even as churches were built nearby, the high ground kept its ancient function, a place where people faced the turning of the year together. The church, perhaps recognizing the futility of suppression, reframed the meaning of the fire. It was no longer a summoning of spirits, but a prayer for souls in purgatory. The evolution from All Saints to All Souls extended this idea even further. While November first honoured the sanctified dead, the following day came to include everyone else, the uncanonised, the forgotten, the countless lives without record. This widening of memory mirrors the older inclusive cosmology of Samhain, when the boundary between the living and the dead was thin and all ancestors could visit. The Christian reinterpretation didn't remove that idea. It translated it into a theology of intercession. The night became a vigil. The dead didn't wander, they were prayed for. Pope Gregory III's establishment of the November feast occurred sometime between 731 and 741. His successor, Gregory IV, made it universal in 835 under the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious. But even then, adoption varied by region. In the records of early medieval Ireland and Wales, there's little immediate evidence that the Saints' Festival displaced the older observances. In some places they coexisted, church bells ringing while fires burned on distant hills. The written word belonged to the clergy, but the night belonged to everyone else. From a cognitive standpoint, this merging of calendars represents a profound example of cultural adaptation. Time itself became a negotiation. The church measured months by the sun, yet the people still felt them through the moon and weather. Samhain's meaning couldn't be erased because it was encoded in the land's ecology. The end of grazing, the migration of birds, the closing of harvest, the arrival of frost. These were not pagan details, they were empirical realities. And so the theology that replaced them had to mirror their emotional function. All Saints and All Souls became a spiritual harvest, a way to reconcile the cyclical with the eternal. In some early Irish sources, traces of this overlap survive. The Martyrology of Ingus from the 9th century mentions the festival on November 1st, but its verses echo far older cadences. Winter's first day, the feast of all the saints. The phrasing itself hints at a double meaning, the turning of the year and the turning of memory. Linguistic evidence also shows that medieval Gaelic terms for November, Samhain or Samhain, remained in use long after Christianization. Language outlasted theology, preserving the old shape of time even as its explanations changed. Anthropologists studying conversion periods often note that belief doesn't flip like a switch, it layers. A villager might attend Mass in the morning and still place an offering for ancestors by firelight that night. In rural Europe, Christianization was less a replacement of myth than a retranslation of it. Heaven and hell absorbed the old geography of the otherworld. Saints inherited the roles of gods, protectors of wells, fields and cattle, And the calendar, that great organiser of ritual, became a palimpsest. Roman months written over Celtic seasons, with traces of both visible if you know where to look. There's also a practical reason for the alignment. The agricultural calendar itself demanded a moment of communal pause in early winter. Once the fields were cleared and the animals sheltered, people could finally afford to gather, feast, and remember. The timing of All Saints' Day made perfect sense as the new liturgical year's threshold. In monastic practice, the period from late October to early November became the hinge between summer work and winter study. The old Celtic New Year had become, without open declaration, the Church's new season of prayer and reflection. But the adoption of the date didn't mean the Church endorsed every practice surrounding it. Medieval sermons and penitentials contained sharp warnings against what they called pagan survivals, divination, bonfire rituals, masking, or leaving food for the dead. Yet the need to forbid these things proves they continued. Across Gaul, Britain and Ireland, people still mark the night as one of transition. Even centuries later, chroniclers complained of rural folk making merry at All Hallows, lighting fires in the fields. In some regions, the fires were tolerated, reinterpreted as symbolic of the light of the saints. In others, they were suppressed, but they never disappeared. What emerges from this period is not a clean conversion, but a slow blending. A calendar once measured by fire and stars became tied to scripture, but its underlying purpose stayed the same, to give structure to mortality, to mark endings and beginnings, to remember the unseen. The difference lay in what was named sacred. Where the Druids had tended cosmic cycles, the monks tended souls. Both, in their own ways, were measuring the distance between light and dark. In this sense, the conversion of time wasn't only theological, it was psychological. Humanity redefined its relationship with the unseen world. The dead no longer returned through open doorways or misty hills. They became subjects of prayer, framed within a doctrine of redemption rather than visitation. Yet emotionally the connection remained. Every November the living still felt the pull of remembrance, the ache of seasonal change, the instinct to gather by light against the encroaching cold. The continuity between Samhain and All Hallows lies there, in the shared comfort of collective ritual. If you could step into that world around 800 years after the Common Era, you might see a small monastery overlooking a valley where farmsteads burn signal fires on the same night. The chapel candles glow for the saints. The Latin chants rise. The wind carries their echo, and beyond the monastery walls, villagers still whisper the names of their ancestors into the smoke. Two systems of belief overlap like constellations, each illuminating the other, neither entirely wrong, both seeking to comfort a world that must face the dark again. It's easy to think of history as replacement, the new erasing the old, but what we see here is inheritance. The Church didn't so much conquer time as adopt it, binding its rituals to rhythms far older than itself. Every bell that rang on November 1st carried the echo of the bonfire that once burned for Samhain, and if you listen closely, across the centuries, both still sound like the same thing, the human wish to make peace with the night. Imagine walking through a village in late October of the 15th century. The fields are bare, the air heavy with smoke and frost, and shapes move through the dusk. Figures wrapped in rags, faces blackened with soot, carrying hollowed turnips glowing from within. They knock on doors, recite verses, and ask for food in exchange for blessings on the dead. To the untrained eye, it might look like mischief, but what you're seeing is memory, a living echo of the world's oldest negotiation between the living and the dead. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Christian calendar had formally claimed early November for All Saints and All Souls, but folk memory proved less obedient than doctrine. Across Britain, Ireland, and much of continental Europe, the nights around that date remained filled with rites of disguise, gift-giving, and quiet fear. The idea was simple. during the brief window when the boundary between worlds thinned, souls, both blessed and restless, moved among the living. Masks and lanterns were not decorations but defences, practical tools for surviving the presence of the unseen. The act of guising, wearing a disguise or adopting the likeness of the dead, is one of the oldest forms of ritual camouflage known in Europe. Its logic is paradoxical. To protect yourself from wandering spirits, you become one of them. Anthropologists call it sympathetic masking. The same principle seen in burial customs, funerary feasts, and seasonal rites across ancient cultures. In Northern Europe, where winter symbolised both death and renewal, these disguises became essential social armour. The geyser stepped into liminal space, neither fully human nor ghost, permitted to walk safely through the haunted threshold of the year. The earliest records of such practices appear in late medieval Scottish and English church accounts. In the 16th century, for example, a parish record from the Highlands finds several young men and women guising on All Hallows Eve, their faces covered, their voices disguised, wandering from house to house. These were not mere pranks. The verses they recited often asked for food for the souls departed, a remnant of the older belief that the living could ease the suffering of the dead through shared nourishment. Bread, cakes, or ale offered to geysers were, in essence, offerings by proxy. The tradition of souling, going door to door collecting small cakes in exchange for prayers, likely grew from this same blend of theology and folk survival. By the late Middle Ages, it was widespread in England, Wales, and parts of Germany. Children and the poor, known as soulers, would sing or chant at doors, promising to pray for the homeowner's dead relatives in return for a soul cake. These cakes, spiced and marked with a cross, symbolise the release of a soul from purgatory. To modern ears it sounds quaint, even innocent. But to those who practised it, the transaction was deadly serious, a miniature act of intercession between worlds. Across rural Ireland and Scotland, similar customs persisted with less Christian framing. Instead of prayers for souls, geysers offered blessings for the household or protection from misfortune, echoing far older ideas of reciprocity between the living and the spirit world. The offerings were often practical: grain, butter, or pieces of bread, the same staples used in winter survival. In some regions, the tradition was known as mumming, combining masked procession with performance. The mummers' plays that developed later retained this structure, costumed figures representing death and rebirth battling for dominance, just as the myths of Lug and Bala once had. The use of lanterns carved from turnips, beets, or even skulls traces to the same seasonal logic. Before the modern era of artificial light, a small flame inside a hollow vegetable was both tool and talisman. The flicker of fire symbolised containment, the safe domestication of a dangerous element. In Celtic and Germanic folklore, a light moving in the dark often represented a wandering soul or ghostly guide, known by many names: will-o'-the-wisp, jack-o'-lantern, fetchlight. To carry one was to hold power over that force, to turn the ghost's flame into a human ally. In this way, the lantern became a spiritual inversion, light used to navigate the night of the dead. Medieval superstition also tied this night to contagion and boundary crossing. In centuries when plague and famine were recurring threats, people understood death as something that could spread, not just physically but spiritually. The fear of contaminated air or miasma blended easily with the notion of spirits crossing into the world of the living. Doors were marked with protective symbols, and fires were kept burning overnight to purify the air. Masks and coverings served both symbolic and practical purposes, concealing identity, but also shielding the wearer from what they believed might be carried on the wind. In that sense, guising was not just ritual theatre, it was community hygiene, an early form of seasonal quarantine wrapped in superstition and celebration. Folklore from Ireland, Brittany and Wales preserves traces of the belief that the dead returned not merely to visit but to inspect. On certain nights of the year, they were thought to judge whether the living had kept proper care of the hearth, the animals, the graves. A well-tended home might be blessed with good luck for the winter, a neglected one could be cursed with illness or loss. Thus households left offerings, bread on the windowsill, milk by the door, candles in the window, both hospitality and insurance. Those who disguised themselves and visited in the name of the dead acted as stand-ins for these spectral guests, enforcing the ancient contract of remembrance. We can still glimpse fragments of this worldview in the linguistic and legal records of the later Middle Ages. Church edicts repeatedly condemn night processions, dances of the dead, and feasts for wandering souls. Yet they never quite vanish. In the 9th century canon episcopi and later penitentials, bishops warn against women who believe that the dead walk by night or who set out food for them. The repetition of the warning across centuries shows how deep the belief ran. The Church could preach doctrine, but it could not rewrite the instincts of a people who measured time through loss and return. By the 15th and 16th centuries, guising had evolved into a form of licensed disorder, the only time of year when social boundaries could briefly dissolve. The poor could become noble, the living could play the dead. This inversion, scholars note, served a social function. It released tension, reaffirmed hierarchy through its temporary subversion, and reminded the community that order required renewal. It was carnival before Lent, winter's echo of summer's fairs. Even when stripped of its overt spiritual meaning, the practice retained its emotional logic, the idea that facing chaos once a year helped contain it for the rest. There is something almost mathematical about how these traditions map onto the natural calendar. Guising and souling emerge precisely when daylight is shortest, harvest is over, and food distribution becomes crucial. The rituals ensured communal sharing. No one could refuse a soul cake without inviting bad luck, just as no one could hoard grain without tempting misfortune. It was social ethics enforced through myth. In a world without welfare systems or written contracts, folklore was the law that kept hunger at bay. The spread of these customs across continental Europe follows familiar migratory paths, from the Celtic-speaking regions of the British Isles into northern France, Flanders, and western Germany. By the late Middle Ages, the practice of lighting candles for the dead, visiting graveyards, and performing mass processions had become embedded in the broader Christian autumnal cycle. Some scholars suggest that the persistence of these customs may have influenced how saints' days and harvest feasts were visually celebrated in art and literature. The halo and the lantern, both symbols of light in darkness merging in popular imagination. Even as literacy expanded and theology refined its doctrines of the afterlife, ordinary people continued to live by the older calendar of feeling. The year's edge was still the time of souls, of thinning veils and lingering fires. In the diaries and marginalia of early modern Europe, we find notes of unease. The Night of All Saints, strange lights on the moor, or the children go guising with lamps of root and sing for the departed. These were not merely curiosities of folklore, they were continuations of a worldview that refused to let death be tidy. By the end of the 16th century, reformers, both Protestant and Catholic, were growing impatient with such survivals. The Reformation's distrust of intercession stripped the theology from soul-caking, reducing it to superstition. In England, Puritan authorities condemned it as idleness. In Catholic regions, it was tolerated only as local colour. Yet the rituals proved resilient. Like the fires of Samhain that once became All Hallows, guising and souling adapted, reinterpreted, and survived. Beneath every act of disguise, there remained a whisper of something older, the belief that remembrance and fear are two sides of the same human instinct, the need to give shape to absence. If you stood in one of those villages at the turn of the 15th century and watched the guisers moving from door to door, you would see not superstition but anthropology in motion. Each lantern, each mask, each shared cake was a unit of cultural survival, a reminder that the boundaries between life and death, order and chaos, have always been porous. The fire still burns because we keep retelling its story, and in every flicker of that light, ancient humanity recognizes itself, afraid, inventive, and quietly hopeful that pretending to be the dead might help us understand how to live. Imagine a small wooden ship creaking across the Atlantic in the 17th century, its hold filled not only with people, but with memories, songs, superstitions, fragments of calendar and custom. Among the Irish, Scottish, and Northern English migrants who would eventually scatter across North America, few carried written traditions, but all carried stories, and hidden within those stories was a single night, one that refused to die. Long after the Druids, long after the monks, long after the fires of Samhain had been reinterpreted by saints, it still lived quietly in the rhythm of rural life, the festival of the turning year, when the light was dying and the dead were close. The old world did not leave its ghosts behind. It brought them to the new. By the time the first waves of settlers reached the shores of New England, the customs that had once marked Samhain had already splintered into regional variations. All Hallows Eve in Catholic Ireland, Nutcrack Night, or Snapapple Night in Protestant Ulster and Scotland, and autumnal vigils of remembrance across Wales and Cornwall. In Europe, these practices were already thinning under the weight of modernity, but in the colonies they found new soil. The early Puritans, of course, had little patience for such papist or pagan observances. Their theology stripped the calendar of saints and seasons alike. Yet beneath the rigid surface of the colonial world, time still turned as it always had, with harvest, frost, and fear of the dark. And among Irish and Scottish communities, especially those arriving later, the customs of autumn carried on quietly, merging with the cycles of the land they now inhabited. The story of how a Bronze Age festival survived an ocean crossing is, at its core, one of cultural adaptation. When people migrate, they cannot carry their fields or temples, but they can carry the invisible scaffolding of belief, a sense of when the world changes. For the Irish and Scottish in North America, October and November were not merely the end of harvest, but the threshold between survival and scarcity. The rituals that once involved hilltop fires and guising evolved naturally into the customs of frontier life. Communal gatherings, bonfires, storytelling, and the marking of the year's death before winter. The landscape was new, but the emotional calendar remained the same. By the 18th century, folklorists and travellers were beginning to record faint echoes of these older observances among immigrant communities. In isolated regions of Nova Scotia, Appalachia, and the American Midwest, accounts describe autumn nights where neighbours gathered to light the hill, burn brush, and tell tales of the dead or of mischievous spirits said to roam the fields. Often these gatherings coincided with the completion of harvest or cider pressing, moments of collective relief after labour. While the religious language of All Hallows faded, the structure of the night endured. Fire, feast, and fear. One of the most enduring transformations in this transatlantic journey was botanical. In the British Isles, turnips and Mangel wurzels were hollowed and carved to create crude lanterns. Their grimacing faces meant to frighten away wandering souls. In North America, settlers found a far more cooperative canvas, the pumpkin. Larger, softer, and more abundant, it quickly replaced the stubborn root vegetables of the Old World. The first documented use of carved pumpkins as lanterns appears in the early 19th century, though the practice likely began earlier in Irish communities. The result was a perfect fusion of practicality and symbolism, a native plant reborn as a vessel for an ancient light. The story of Jack-o'-lantern, the trickster condemned to wander with his ember, may have crossed the Atlantic in oral form, blending with local tales of will-o'-the-wisps and swamp lights. But what matters is not the name, but the persistence of the idea, that the living need a light to keep the darkness company. Across the frontier, as families built cabins and settlements far from any church or town, the small ritual of placing a glowing face in the window or on a fence post became a gesture of belonging, an echo of Europe's communal fires scaled down to a single home. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, another kind of blending occurred. In the absence of a unified European liturgical calendar, North America developed its own patchwork of seasonal festivals. Colonial harvest suppers, Native American harvest ceremonies, and Protestant Thanksgiving gatherings all revolved around the same emotional axis: gratitude for survival, fear of scarcity, remembrance of those lost. It is within this psychological landscape that the remnants of Samhain quietly persisted. The old fire festival of death and renewal disguised itself as celebration of plenty. What had once been the year's ending now became its symbolic conclusion, a closing chapter before winter's long pause. Written references to All Hallows' Eve appear sporadically in colonial diaries and sermons, usually with disapproval. Ministers warned against the idle superstition of the Irish and Highlanders, who keep this night with games and bonfires. Yet by condemning it, they preserved it. The ritual of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏, already centuries old, survived in rural and immigrant enclaves as playful disorder. In some accounts, children or young adults went door to door in disguise, asking for cakes and apples. The words of one 18th century New England diarist describe it perfectly. They came as the spirits of the year departed. Whether or not he understood the old symbolism, the description captures it exactly. For the Irish, particularly those who arrived in the massive waves of the 19th century, such customs carried the weight of identity. The Great Famine of the 1840s scattered millions across the world. To many, the small rituals of their homeland became a way of remembering who they were. Songs sung on winter nights, prayers for the dead, and yes, the old traditions of All Hallows. In the tenements of New York, Boston, and Montreal, these gatherings offered a link to a past not yet fossilized. Immigrant newspapers from the period occasionally mention Halloween frolics, describing parties, firelit games, and fortune-telling. Even stripped of overt religiosity, the festival remained about thresholds, between lands, between lives, between old and new. What makes this story remarkable is not merely continuity, but transformation. Each migration translated the ritual into the language of its new environment. The open-air bonfires of rural Ireland became indoor candlelight. The sacred hills became city courtyards and back alleys. Instead of entire villages gathering to extinguish and relight hearths, families lit lamps to keep the memory alive. Over time, the solemnity softened. As communities urbanized and mingled, the night became less about appeasing spirits and more about celebrating imagination, still haunted but playful. The shift was not betrayal, but adaptation. Folklorists of the 19th century, like Sir James Fraser and later Alexander Carmichael, saw in these survivals proof of Europe's pagan substratum. But the lived reality was more fluid. People didn't preserve Samhain consciously. They simply continued to do what made emotional sense, to face the darkness together with story, fire and disguise. Even as literacy expanded and theology shifted, the old instinct remained, that time turns in circles, not lines, and that each year demands its symbolic death before renewal. Across North America, the descendants of Irish and Scottish immigrants carried these habits into new regions, merging them with local harvest customs. In parts of Appalachia, October nights were marked by telling the hints, ghost stories told by lamplight, often ending with moral lessons. In Canada, rural communities continued bonfires well into the 19th century, calling the night All Hallows, or simply Hallowe'en. By then, the church's influence over the date had waned, but the rhythm of the season remained identical. The boundaries between celebration, remembrance, and fear blurred, just as they had 3,000 years before in the firelight of ancient Europe. To trace this continuity is to glimpse something profound about human culture. Rituals survive not because institutions preserve them, but because they meet a need that biology itself seems to recognise. In every generation, there is a time when the world darkens and people gather around light. The fire may change shape, from torch to hearth to lantern, but its function does not. It is a beacon against extinction, a rehearsal for spring. When the Irish and Scottish crossed the ocean, they didn't bring Halloween with them. They brought the habit of keeping the dark company. By the late 19th century, ethnographers began to notice how thoroughly this transplanted festival had taken root in the New World. Reports from American newspapers describe bonfires on hilltops, lantern parades, and mischief nights that looked startlingly like their European precursors. In the immigrant imagination, the Atlantic had become just another threshold, one more boundary to cross before light returned. And so the fires that once burned on Irish hillsides now burned on American plains, echoing the same human equation of fear and joy, order and chaos, death and renewal. The ancient year-end ritual had survived empire, conversion, and exile. It had crossed an ocean not as dogma, but as memory, disguised, adapted, but unbroken. The Night of the Dead had become the night of stories, and through every migration and translation it remained faithful to its oldest promise, that light, once kindled, could travel anywhere. Imagine that tonight is the same night it has always been. Somewhere far from the noise of cities, the sky is clear enough to see Orion rising. The fields are bare, the air cold and sharp. You can almost hear the soil tighten under frost. A small fire burns, and for a moment it feels like the oldest thing you know. No calendar, no doctrine, no civilization ever truly replaced this feeling. The quiet awareness that the year is dying, and that light must be coaxed back into being. If fire once kept away the dark outside, what do we light it for now? Every generation has answered that question differently. For the people who gathered around the first hilltop flames 5,000 years ago, fire was literal survival. Warmth, safety and signal. It was the line between predator and prey, between night and knowledge. To extinguish it, even briefly, was to flirt with extinction. For the farmers of the Iron Age, it became something larger, a negotiation with time itself. They learned that the year needed its darkness, that fertility required rest, that even the sun must fade to return renewed. To light the new fire at winter's threshold was to admit both fear and trust. Fear that the world might not turn again, trust that it would. When Christianity arrived, that ritual logic didn't die, it simply changed its clothes. The saints replaced the ancestors, candles replaced bonfires, and prayers replaced chants. But the structure of feeling, that strange calm in the face of decay, endured. The church understood what every culture before it had known, that humans cannot face endless light. We need endings. We need the night. And so, across centuries of empire and exile, we kept this one night that belonged to the threshold, the edge between harvest and hunger, memory and oblivion, presence and absence. In a way, the fire is no longer for the darkness around us, but for the one within. The same impulse that drew villagers to the hills now drives us to gather under smaller, humbler lights. Candles on a table, lamps in a window, pixels glowing in the palm of a hand. We don't fear wolves or the cold anymore, but we still fear uncertainty, isolation, forgetting. The bonfire was never only about survival. It was about reassurance, a proof that someone else was out there, lighting their fire too. When the valleys below went dark so that a single flame could be reborn, the message was clear. No one outlasts the night alone. Samhain, in all its transformations, is a testament to continuity, not of ritual form, but of need. We have always needed to mark the boundaries of things, the last day of summer, the first frost, the threshold between the living and the dead. To ignore those boundaries is to lose orientation. Even in our hyper-lit, sleepless world, time still turns in the same quiet way. The earth still tilts, the days still shrink. The stars above us are the same ones that the Druids charted, the same ones mirrored in the bronze of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 calendar, the same ones that guided ships across the Atlantic carrying half-remembered prayers for the dead. If you look closely, modern life still hums with these old patterns. The names have shifted, the tools changed, but the gestures remain familiar. We still gather at the close of the year, still share food to mark survival, still light small flames against the dark. The details differ. A candle in a window, a lantern on a doorstep, a meal shared with family, but the emotion beneath them is the same old rhythm. Remembrance, gratitude, and renewal. The dead no longer walk beside us, but we walk with their echoes. Every ritual we perform, however trivial it seems, is an act of continuity, a bridge between our brief moment and the deep time behind it. Anthropologists often describe festivals like Samhain as liminal, meaning transitional. But that word barely captures their depth. To live at the edge of light and dark is to experience time as cyclical, not linear. In those moments, people don't simply observe change, they participate in it. Lighting a fire is a declaration of faith in renewal, that decay is not an ending, but a necessary transformation. Perhaps this is why the motif of the dying sun, the returning light, appears in so many myths, from Egypt to Scandinavia to the Celtic hills. The story keeps repeating because the physics of our world demands it, and our minds have learned to translate that cosmic rhythm into meaning. The continuity of these rituals also reveals something about human memory. We rarely remember facts for millennia, but we remember patterns. The old fires, the feasts, the masks, all survive because they mirror the structure of our emotions. We grieve and celebrate in circles just as nature does. Even now, when the meaning of the ritual has faded for most, the timing remains perfect. Late autumn still feels like closure. The smell of smoke, the dimming of days, the cold that sharpens thought. These sensory cues awaken something older than history. In that way, the tradition doesn't survive through teaching, but through instinct. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten. Archaeologists once believed that culture advanced by replacement, that each age swept away the one before it. But looking at the long survival of Samhain, we see something subtler. Inheritance by layering. The Bronze Age and the medieval, the pagan and the Christian, the rural and the modern, they don't cancel each other out, they accumulate. What we call tradition is really a sediment of memory, compressed over centuries. We are the latest layer in that ongoing fossil of human imagination. And just as the first fire pits of prehistory still contain traces of ash, so do our modern rituals still carry embers of their origins. There is humility in that realization. It reminds us that our control over time is an illusion. We build calendars, schedules, and digital clocks, but the ancient year still moves according to the tilt of the planet, the decay of leaves, and the migration of light. Each October, whether we know it or not, we participate in an old dialogue with the universe, acknowledging that darkness is not failure, but balance. The first people who lit fires on the Irish hills knew this in their bones. They were not trying to defy winter. They were greeting it, inviting the night to pass through, not around them. Maybe that's what we've forgotten, that darkness is not the enemy of light, but its origin. In every myth, creation begins in shadow. The void, the deep, the chaos before the dawn. To light a fire is to honour that paradox, the idea that something must end for something else to begin. Samhain's genius lies in that simple truth. It teaches us to see endings as sacred, not tragic. The year doesn't die, it transforms. And in that transformation, we are reminded that life itself depends on cycles of return. If you stand outside on a cold night and stare into a flame, you can feel that continuity stretching behind you. A line of anonymous hands doing the same across 10,000 generations. They didn't know the names we use, or the dates, or the saints, but they knew how to wait, how to endure the dark without panicking. Maybe that is the oldest skill humanity ever learned, patience before renewal. Today our fires are smaller, quieter, and less communal, yet they still mean the same thing. A candle lit for remembrance, a string of lights in a window, even the ritual of telling stories when the nights grow long, all of these are echoes of that first winter's night. We may no longer believe that spirits walk beside us, but we still sense that something passes between worlds when the air turns cold. Maybe it's not ghosts we feel, but the gravity of time itself, the pull of everything that came before us. To understand Samhain is to understand that we have never truly been separate from the past. The festival is not about what we lost, but about what we keep alive through repetition. Every autumn the world rehearses the same lesson, that decay and beauty are intertwined, that the end of light is also the promise of warmth returning. The first fires burned for survival, ours burn for meaning. But both say the same thing, that even when the world darkens, we remember how to make light. And so tonight, as the earth tilts deeper into its shadowed season, remember that this too is part of the rhythm. Light the small flame, not to banish the dark, but to welcome it, because the darkness has always been where renewal begins,